That day, I had the strangest dream. In this dream, there was a line of text explicitly stating it was a work of fiction, yet I still found myself reading the entire story until the very end. My name is Chloe, and I'm 34 years old. At our annual family Thanksgiving dinner, my grandfather handed my parents, my older brother and me, each a heavy brass safe key and a single handwritten ledger page. The moment he did, the entire room erupted into hysterical laughter. My father scoffed loudly, telling me it was just another one of the old man's senile pranks, and that I shouldn't be an idiot by taking it seriously. I watched in disbelief as my family casually tossed those brass keys into the roaring flames of the expensive gas fire pit in the backyard, treating them like complete garbage. Saying absolutely nothing, I quietly slipped my key and the note into my pocket. The next morning, inside a high-security private vault in downtown San Francisco, the manager's face went completely pale. He immediately pulled me into his bulletproof glass office, lowered his voice, and told me we needed to talk. Before I reveal what happened next, if you've ever had to survive inside a suffocating family that constantly devalues your worth, take a moment to give yourself some credit. Growing up in Atherton, an ultra-wealthy enclave in California's Silicon Valley, I learned a harsh truth very early on. In our house, love was a strictly transactional business. You were either actively building up the family's prestige, or you were completely invisible. My father, Arthur, a former top-tier corporate litigation attorney, and my mother, Eleanor, a prominent socialite obsessed with high-end charity galas, made these rules brutally clear from day one. Our sprawling mansion, with its flawless California drought-tolerant landscaping and massive modern glass facades, was custom-built to project absolute perfection to the outside world. But on the inside, it was an emotional deep freezer. Every single holiday was an exhausting performance where everyone had to play their designated parts. The Thanksgiving table was meticulously set with my mother's pride and joy, custom bone china and sterling silver cutlery that caught the dark red reflection of a Napa Valley Reserve Cabernet. The air carried the rich aroma of roasted turkey and expensive black truffles. It looked like the picture-perfect image of a happy family gathering, but the emotional temperature in the room was freezing. I sat there quietly, mindlessly pushing organic vegetables around my plate, coldly observing the toxic family dynamics that had dictated my entire life. My 37-year-old brother, Julian, sat at the head of the long table right next to my father. Julian was the undisputed golden child of the family. He was loud, arrogant, and incredibly reckless with money. While I worked 3 jobs just to put myself through a state university for civil engineering, Julian had his entire Ivy League education fully funded by my parents. When he failed his classes, they blamed biased professors. When he totaled his brand new Porsche, they blamed the slippery roads during California's rainy season. He had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. Right now, Julian was dominating the conversation, bragging endlessly about his latest grand business venture. Leaning back in his custom leather dining chair, he swirled his wine glass, showing off his Silicon Valley cryptocurrency and decentralized finance startup. Buzzwords like decentralized leverage, disruptive algorithms, and Web3 ecosystems kept flying out of his mouth with the unearned confidence of a gambler playing with someone else's money. He went into explicit detail about how he planned to acquire a series of critical server nodes to monopolize a trading network. I knew for a fact that his previous 3 tech startups had completely collapsed, leaving behind a trail of furious angel investors and unpaid independent contractor bills. But in my parents' eyes, Julian could do no wrong. My father, Arthur, looked at him with a flushed, beaming face, his eyes filled with the absolute pride I had spent my entire childhood chasing but never received. "This is exactly the kind of radical expansion our family needs, Julian," my father said, raising his glass for a toast. "You have the vision to secure our legacy. Don't worry about short-term cash flow issues. If those venture capitalists are too short-sighted, I'll gladly bridge the funding for your next round. We need to keep pushing forward and show the entire Bay Area what we're capable of." I sat there, listening to my father pledge hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund my brother's delusions. The truth was, I had come home tonight with my own good news. After years of grinding in the intensely competitive field of structural engineering, I had just been promoted to lead bridge safety assessment engineer at a top infrastructure firm in San Francisco. It was a massive milestone. I had earned this role through 60-hour work weeks of intense field inspections, countless sleepless nights building stress models, and pure, unyielding grit. I was now managing a team of 30 senior engineers and taking home a substantial salary that gave me total financial independence. I was incredibly proud of myself. I waited for a brief pause in Julian's endless monologue, gently clearing my throat to share my achievement. "I just signed my promotion contract this week," I said, keeping my tone light but hopeful. "I'm officially the lead structural engineer for the Golden Gate Bridge seismic retrofit project. I'll be overseeing the physical architecture and safety certification for the entire southern span." My mother, Eleanor, didn't even look up from carving the turkey. "That's nice, dear," she said, waving her perfectly manicured hand dismissively. "But how can inspecting concrete and drawing blueprints compare to leading a tech revolution? Julian is building the future of a digital empire. He's creating a multi-billion-dollar unicorn company. You really should focus on finding a husband with some standing in the venture capital world who can support you, instead of playing with your little building blocks in the mud all day." The insult burned hot in my chest, but I was used to it. Every single achievement of mine was systematically minimized just to protect my brother's fragile ego. If I won an industry award, it was cute. If Julian managed to tie his own shoes without tripping, they declared it a stroke of absolute genius. My fiancé Marcus, a former Marine and now a senior cybersecurity consultant, couldn't make it to dinner because a massive blizzard in Seattle had delayed his flight. He had warned me ahead of time not to expect any validation from them. He always told me that my worth wasn't defined by people who refused to see it. He was an incredibly supportive partner, and he was completely right. Still, sitting at my own family's table and feeling completely invisible never stopped stinging. I took a slow sip of water, refusing to let them see my frustration. I reminded myself that I didn't need their money or their approval to survive. I had built my life brick by brick on my own. But the blatant disrespect still hung heavy in the air, clouding the dinner table like a toxic fog. Sitting at the far end of the long table was my grandfather, Harrison. He was 85 years old, wearing a well-tailored but heavily dated tweed blazer. In his youth, he had been a massive railroad and logistics tycoon in Montana, but he had lived an incredibly low-profile life since retiring. My parents treated him like a senile burden, an inconvenience they merely tolerated during the holidays to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. They constantly cut him off, rolled their eyes whenever he shared stories from his youth, and took it for granted that his mind was completely gone. Just because his physical movements had slowed down, they falsely assumed his mental sharpness had faded too. They thought he was just a weak old man, slowly fading into the background of their vibrant, highly successful high society lives. They were dead wrong. Throughout the entire Thanksgiving dinner, Harrison had remained completely silent. Sitting perfectly straight, he watched the toxic family dynamic unfold with an incredibly sharp, calculating gaze, not missing a single detail. He watched his son blindly pledge a fortune to a fool. He watched his daughter-in-law cruelly minimize my hard-earned success. He absorbed every single ounce of arrogance radiating from Julian. Suddenly, Harrison picked up his heavy sterling silver soup spoon and struck his crystal water glass sharply. The piercing metallic ring cleanly cut through Julian's endless bragging about blockchain regulatory arbitrage. The entire table fell into a shocked, dead silence. My grandfather rarely spoke at these dinners, preferring to observe from the sidelines. My father, Arthur, looked incredibly annoyed by the sudden interruption. He let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, addressing his own father as if speaking to a disruptive toddler. "What is it, Dad?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you need someone to help you to the restroom again? Did you forget it's Thanksgiving?" Harrison completely ignored the blatant disrespect. He sat up perfectly straight, his eyes clear, sharp, and highly focused. He reached down into the vintage leather briefcase resting by his feet. We watched in confused silence as he slowly pulled out 3 small, heavy linen bags and 3 yellowed ledger pages torn from a book. Without a word, he slid them across the heavy mahogany dining table. He gave one to my father and mother, one to Julian, and finally one to me. I sat there, holding the small linen bag tight in my hand. I carefully opened it to find a vintage, heavy brass key engraved with a complex string of numbers. Inside the bag was also that single piece of paper covered in my grandfather's elegant, remarkably steady cursive, detailing a precise set of coordinates and a passcode. I've spent the entire evening listening to you all talk about legacy, wealth, and power, Harrison said. His voice was steady, cutting through the room with a chilling, absolute authority. I've listened to you brag about your investments. I've watched how you treat one another. And I've decided it's time to distribute my liquid assets. My time is growing short, and I want to see with my own eyes exactly how you handle your inheritance while I'm still around to witness it. My brother let out a loud, mocking laugh, clearly amused by the very idea that this frail old man could offer us anything of actual value. He obviously thought grandfather was handing out worthless, decades-old railroad bonds, or the key to some dusty storage unit in a forgotten small town. "Oh, come on, Grandpa," Julian scoffed, twirling the heavy brass key between his fingers with a smug grin. "What is this? The key to a tractor on your broken-down farm in Montana?" I looked down at the ledger page in my hand, and the words written there made my breath catch in my throat. It read, San Francisco, Pacific Fortress Private Vaults, Category A Deposit Box. Contents, certified bearer bonds and digital offshore trust hardware wallet. Current valuation, $8 million. I blinked hard, certain that the dim dining room lighting was playing tricks on my eyes. I read the numbers again, making sure I wasn't hallucinating. Each key represented $8 million. I looked up, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I glanced across the table. Julian was staring down at his note, the arrogant smirk frozen solid on his face. My father had gone completely silent, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process the astronomical figure sitting right in front of him. My mother just stared at her key, looking as if the air had been entirely sucked out of her lungs. $8 million each. $24 million total, just casually resting on the Thanksgiving table right next to the cranberry sauce and dinner rolls. The sheer scale of the wealth Harrison had just dropped into our laps was paralyzing. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the massive room was the low hiss of the artificial logs in the gas fire pit. Each of us held a tiny object, capable of instantly changing the entire trajectory of our lives. The heavy silence holding the room hostage was shattered when Julian threw his head back and erupted into a deafening, theatrical laugh. It was a harsh, incredibly grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings, completely destroying whatever fragile piece was left at the table. He pinched the brass key between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dirty paper towel. He waved the ledger note in the air like a cheap prop from a magic shop. "Oh, this is priceless," Julian chuckled, his face turning red from his own amusement. He slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, rattling the crystal wine glasses. $8 million? Seriously, Grandpa? I know you've been a little forgetful lately, but I didn't realize you'd completely lost your grip on reality. Do you think it's still 1980? Bearer bonds? Those went extinct ages ago. Did you just print some fake papers off the internet and find some scrap metal to fool us? I sat frozen, watching the ugly scene play out. The disrespect was so casual, so deeply embedded in his character, that he didn't hesitate for a second to humiliate an 85-year-old man in front of the entire family. I looked at Harrison, expecting to see hurt or confusion in his eyes. Instead, he sat like an absolute rock. His face was a cold, calm, unreadable mask. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He just watched Julian with the quiet intensity of a predator studying its prey. My father, Arthur, let out a heavy sigh and rubbed the bridge of his nose, acting as if dealing with us was the heaviest burden a man could bear. He reached over, snatched the note out of Julian's hand, glanced at it for a split second, and threw it back onto the table with utter disgust. He shook his head and looked at my mother, sharing a silent agreement that Harrison had finally crossed the line from elderly eccentricity into total dementia. Arthur turned his sharp gaze to me, catching the shock on my face. He pointed a thick finger in my direction, his voice dripping with his usual condescension. "Get that look off your face, Chloe," he snapped. "It's fake. Don't be an idiot. Your grandfather doesn't even know what year it is, let alone possess $24 million in liquid assets. He's been scraping by on his modest pension in rural Montana for the last decade. This is just another one of his confused episodes. Don't humiliate him further by pretending it's real." The sheer arrogance of his words made my blood boil. Harrison had never relied on my father's charity. He lived quietly on his own terms, built on the foundation of his early life. But in Arthur's mind, anyone who wasn't generating massive corporate tech wealth in Silicon Valley was essentially worthless. He had always viewed his own father as a social liability. Julian leaned back in his chair, clearly emboldened by our father's validation. He picked up his key again, a dangerous spark in his eyes this time. "You know what we should do with these fake antiques?" he asked, looking around the table like a ringmaster demanding his audience's attention. "We get rid of them before they clutter up the house." To prove his point, Julian stood up dramatically, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He walked out onto the patio just beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, where the expensive gas fire pit was roaring. The flames rolled, sending waves of heat into the cool California night air. Julian stood before the fire, his silhouette casting a long dark shadow over the Thanksgiving decor. Without a single moment of hesitation, he tossed his brass key and his note directly into the fire pit. We all watched as the paper instantly curled, blackened, and burst into bright orange flames, turning to ash in a matter of seconds. The brass key dropped deep into the grates of the fire pit, falling beneath the complex network of ceramic logs and gas lines, completely unreachable unless someone smashed the incredibly expensive setup to pieces. Julian clapped his hands together with a satisfied smirk, as if he had just performed a great public service. Arthur looked at his son with deep approval. Not wanting to be outdone in his own home, my father picked up his and my mother's set. He didn't even bother to look at them again. He stood up, joined his favorite son out by the fire pit, and threw his keys and notes into the roaring flames as well. "There," Arthur said, returning to his seat and raising his glass. "Now that we've cleared out the nonsense, we can get back to real business. Julian, remind me of the terms for your Series C bridge loan. I want to make sure my capital is being deployed efficiently." The casual destruction of the gift was sickening. Even if they truly believed the money was fake, the sheer cruelty of destroying a gift right in front of the person who gave it to you was something I couldn't stomach. I looked at my mother, Eleanor, expecting her to at least offer some polite mediation to smooth over the social awkwardness. Instead, Eleanor let out an impatient sigh, giving her wrist a graceful flick as she raised her crystal glass. She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that the spotlight had briefly shifted away from their wealth and status. "Well, that was a bizarre interruption," Eleanor murmured, taking an elegant sip of her wine. "As I was saying, we need to finalize the guest list for the spring charity gala. I absolutely refuse to have the governor seated next to that dreadful real estate developer from the West Side." The conversation instantly snapped back to their shallow, high society gossip. It was as if the incident with Harrison had never happened. They had collectively decided to erase him from the evening's narrative. I sat there, gripping my brass key, and note so tightly my knuckles turned white. The anger inside me was a living, breathing thing, ready to boil over. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to flip the table and demand they show my grandfather an ounce of basic human decency. But years of surviving in this family had taught me that emotional reactions only gave them ammunition. If I raised my voice, my father would call me hysterical. If I defended Harrison, my mother would accuse me of making a scene. They would use my empathy as proof that I was weak and unsuited for their cutthroat world. Julian noticed me staring down at my hands. He nudged my father with his elbow, pointing at me with a low sneer. "Look at her, Dad. She's still holding on to it. I think our little bridge engineer actually thinks she just became a millionaire." Arthur let out a short, dismissive chuckle. "Put that garbage away, Chloe. You're embarrassing yourself. If you want to make real money, you need to stop playing in the dirt at construction sites and learn how the real world works. You're 34 years old. It's time to stop believing in fairy tales." Eleanor chimed in, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Oh, let her keep it, Arthur. It's probably the closest she'll ever get to $8 million. It'll make a nice little souvenir for her apartment." The cruel mockery rang in my ears, but I forced myself to remain completely still. I looked back at Harrison. His gaze met mine across the long table. There was no sadness in his eyes. Instead, there was a silent, commanding intensity, a look that told me to hold my ground. I didn't believe for a second that the key was real. I knew Harrison lived a simple life, and the idea of him having $24 million in liquid assets made no logical sense. But in that moment, the reality of the money didn't matter to me at all. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to participate in their sickening display of arrogance. "I'm not throwing it in the fire," I said, my voice low but absolutely steady. Julian rolled his eyes, pouring himself another glass of wine. "Suit yourself, loser. Just don't try to cash it at your local credit union. They might lock you up for fraud." I completely ignored his sarcasm. I carefully folded the note and placed it, along with the heavy brass key, into the zippered inside pocket of my leather tote bag sitting on the chair beside me. I pulled the zipper closed with a sharp, definitive click. I wasn't doing this because of some sudden delusion of grandeur. I did it out of basic human respect for my grandfather. He had handed me a gift, and I was going to treat it like one, even if the rest of my family viewed it as a punchline. The remainder of Thanksgiving dinner blurred together in a haze of clinking silverware and hollow, arrogant chatter. Julian continued to outline his doomed crypto empire, while Arthur nodded along, funding the disaster with his own massive ego. Eleanor complained about her social rivals and the incompetent staff at the country club. I finished the rest of my food in total silence, contributing absolutely nothing to the conversation. I was just counting down the minutes until I could politely excuse myself and return to the peace of my own home, where my incredibly supportive fiancé, Marcus, was waiting for my call. When dinner was finally over, I stood up and walked over to Harrison. I leaned down and gently kissed his wrinkled cheek. The classic crisp scent of his aftershave was a stark contrast to the suffocating arrogance filling the room. "Thank you for the gift, Grandpa," I whispered softly, keeping my voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "I appreciate it." Harrison patted my hand, his skin cool and papery. His deep eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting second I saw something incredibly sharp and dangerous flash beneath his calm exterior. "Keep it safe, Chloe," he replied, his voice barely audible. "You'll need it much sooner than you think." I offered a polite smile, thinking it was just a sweet, rambling comment from an old man trying to maintain his dignity after a brutal public humiliation. I said my goodbyes to my parents, ignoring their cold, dismissive nods, and walked out the heavy front door into the cool California night. The evening breeze hit me, cutting through the heat of the house, and it felt 1,000 times better than the toxic atmosphere inside. I got into my car, blasted the heater, and drove back toward downtown San Francisco. My bag sat on the passenger seat right next to me. I completely forgot about the folded note and the key inside it, convinced that tonight was just another painful chapter in my family's long, cruel history. I had absolutely no idea that the key inside my bag was essentially a loaded weapon, just waiting for the trigger to be pulled. The morning light filtering through my apartment windows was a harsh, cold gray. I woke up to the vibration of my phone alarm, breaking away from a restless nightmare filled with burning paper and my brother's mocking laughter. The events of the Thanksgiving dinner still sat heavy in my chest, a toxic reminder of why I usually limited my visits home. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of black coffee, trying to shake off the lingering tension. Marcus had texted me the night before after his flight landed in Seattle, and he called shortly after I woke up, his voice warm and grounding. I told him everything that had happened at the dinner table. I described the arrogance, the casual cruelty, and the bizarre, dramatic destruction of the keys. Marcus listened patiently, never interrupting. When I finished, he let out a long sigh, expressing absolute disbelief at their behavior. He told me I was strong for keeping my composure and reminded me that we had our own life to focus on, a life built on mutual respect and real achievements. I completely agreed with him. But as we hung up, my eyes drifted over to my leather bag resting on the kitchen island. The folded piece of paper and the heavy key were still inside that zippered pocket. I knew it was fake. It had to be. My grandfather lived a remarkably simple life in Montana, driving a 15-year-old Ford pickup. The idea of him handing out $24 million in liquid assets was mathematically and logically impossible. Yet, a tiny voice in the back of my mind refused to let it go. It was the same voice that drove me to obsessively double-check my bridge stress blueprints for unseen errors. I needed closure. I needed a vault clerk to look at it, give me a sympathetic smile, and confirm it was just a novelty prop. Only then could I throw it away and permanently close the book on my family's holiday madness. I dressed for work, putting on a sharp dark blazer and tailored trousers, projecting the professional confidence required of a lead engineer. I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the crisp San Francisco morning. The vault was located in the financial district, and I decided to make a quick stop on my way to the office. It was a Tuesday, and the facility, named Pacific Fortress Private Vaults, had just opened for the day. The interior was incredibly quiet, the air smelling faintly of air purifiers and polished marble. It didn't look like a standard bank at all. It felt more like a high-security diplomatic facility. I walked up to the front desk, where a young receptionist named Sarah greeted me politely. She asked how she could help me today. I reached into my bag, pulled out the folded note and the heavy brass key, and slid them across the polished marble counter. "I'd like to verify this," I said, keeping my voice as casual as possible. "I'm fairly certain it's a prank gift from a relative, but I just want to confirm before I throw it out. I promise I'm not trying to pull a scam." Sarah smiled politely and picked up the heavy paper. At first, she didn't even look at the numbers. She just flipped it over to look at the specific coordinate codes unique to their facility, and then she picked up the brass key. I watched the exact millisecond her brain processed the information. Her fingers froze, hovering directly over her keyboard. Her polite customer service smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. She blinked hard, bringing the key and the note closer to her face as if inspecting microscopic markings. Her eyes darted from the paper to her computer screen and then back to the key. "Is there a problem?" I asked, preparing to laugh it off and take the fake items back. Sarah didn't answer me. Her breathing became noticeably shallow. She picked up a small scanner, ran the barcode on the key, and typed the passcode from the note into her system. The scanner let out a sharp, automated beep. Instantly, her screen flashed a bright warning red. Sarah let out a soft gasp and hit a button on her keyboard, causing her entire monitor to lock down immediately. "Ma'am, I need you to wait right here for just one moment," Sarah stammered, her voice visibly shaking. She didn't make eye contact with me. She turned and practically sprinted toward the back offices, clutching the key tightly to her chest as if it were a live grenade. I stood at the counter, a sudden spike of anxiety hitting my stomach. My brother Julian had joked that I'd be locked up for fraud if I tried to cash it. For one terrifying second, I wondered if my family had set me up. What if this was a deeply coordinated, cruel joke designed to get me into legal trouble? My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. I looked around the quiet lobby, half expecting security guards to come marching toward me. Instead, the heavy mahogany door to the back offices opened, and the manager of the vault stepped out. He was a seasoned finance professional in his late 50s, radiating a cold corporate composure. Today, however, the manager, a Mr. Sterling, looked entirely different. His face was completely pale as he held my grandfather's key and note. He walked toward me with quick, urgent strides, completely ignoring the only one or two other clients in the lobby. "Ms. Chloe," he said, his voice tight with suppressed tension, "could you please step into my office right now?" It wasn't a question. He gestured toward a massive bulletproof glass office in the corner of the building. I swallowed hard, nodded, and followed him. As I passed the reception desk, I noticed Sarah watching me with wide, completely terrified eyes. We stepped inside, and Mr. Sterling closed the heavy door firmly, instantly shutting out the ambient noise of the vault lobby. He walked over to the electronic blinds, pressing a button that sent frosted panels sliding down, completely blocking the view from anyone outside. "Please, have a seat," he instructed, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive desk. I sat down, my hands gripping the armrests tightly. "Look, I know it's fake," I began, rushing to explain myself. "My grandfather gave it to me at Thanksgiving dinner. My whole family thought it was a joke. I just wanted to confirm before throwing it away. I swear I'm not trying to commit fraud." Mr. Sterling raised a hand, cutting off my panicked explanation. He sank heavily into his chair, placing the key and the note gently onto the spotless desk surface. He stared at them for a long moment before finally looking up at me. He leaned across the desk, closing the distance between us, and lowered his voice to a sharp, intense whisper. "Ma'am, we need to talk," he said. I took a deep breath, preparing for a lecture on facility policy or a threat to call the police. I braced myself to defend my reputation. "This key is not a fake," he whispered, his eyes locking dead onto mine. I stared at him, my brain completely refusing to process the words he had just spoken. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, convinced I had misheard him. Mr. Sterling reached across the desk and picked up a secure tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, pulling up a highly restricted vault interface I had never seen before. When my clerk scanned the internal identification code on this key and entered the passcode, it immediately triggered an automatic maximum security lockdown on her terminal, he explained, his voice still incredibly low. That only happens when a branch-level employee attempts to access a transaction tied to a Tier 1 offshore digital wealth management account. "I don't understand what that means," I replied, my voice trembling. "It means," he said, tapping the screen again, The assets drawn by this key and this specific passcode are held in a trust so exclusive and highly fortified that my local staff doesn't even have the security clearance to view the balance. I had to use my executive override to contact our Central Wealth Management Division in New York directly to verify the hardware wallet's serial numbers and legitimacy. He turned the tablet slightly so I could see the screen. It showed a secure communication log with senior banking executives. "I just got off the secure line with their chief verification officer," Mr. Sterling said, taking a deep breath. "They have confirmed that the trust is entirely legitimate, established by Harrison. They verified that the passcode matches the hardware wallet's biometric records, and Ms. Chloe, they confirmed the funds." He paused, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "The funds are all there, every single cent. This key and passcode are completely real." The air left the room. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears. I gripped the leather armrests of the chair so hard my fingers turned white. I tried to speak, but my throat was completely dry. "Are you telling me?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "My grandfather actually has $8 million? Mr. Sterling let out a sigh that sounded almost like a laugh. "Ma'am, this level of trust account requires a minimum standing balance of $50 million just to open. I don't know the exact extent of your grandfather's wealth, but I can assure you it is absolutely staggering. And right now I have direct authorization from New York to handle this transfer immediately." He typed a final sequence of numbers into his secure tablet. He hit the enter key with a sharp, definitive click. I watched his screen load. A bright green confirmation banner flashed across the interface. Mr. Sterling looked up at me, the color slowly returning to his face. "The asset transfer has officially cleared," he announced, his voice returning to its normal volume. "The bearer bonds within the safety deposit box and the hardware wallets containing digital offshore assets have been fully transferred into a private wealth isolation account under your name. I'll need to immediately upgrade your account status to our private wealth division to handle a deposit of this magnitude, but everything is fully taken care of." I sank back into the leather chair. The sheer weight of reality hit me like a tidal wave. $8 million. It was sitting right there in my account. It was mine. My grandfather, the man my parents and brother treated like an old, clueless burden, was secretly sitting on top of a mind-blowing financial empire. Then, a second realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The fireplace, the mocking laughter, the arrogant tossing away of a brass key that represented a life-changing fortune. My father and my brother had each held $8 million in their hands. Just to prove their cruel sense of superiority, they had personally destroyed a combined $16 million, turning it into worthless ash and melted scrap metal. And my mother, driven by pure arrogance, watched her own share get completely ruined. Out of sheer, unadulterated hubris, they had personally destroyed their own salvation. I was the only one who kept the key. I was the only one who showed Harrison an ounce of basic human respect. Because of that, I walked into a bank vault on a chilly Tuesday morning and walked out a multimillionaire. The metaphorical weapon I carried in my bag had just fired, and it was going to change absolutely everything. I walked out of the vault in a total daze. The biting San Francisco ocean breeze hit my face, but I could barely feel the cold. I drove straight home, sat on my couch, and stared at my updated private wealth app interface. The numbers on the screen were undeniable. $8 million. For the next 3 days, I lived in an out-of-body state. I went to work as usual, I talked to Marcus, and I kept this earth-shattering secret completely locked away inside me. Marcus noticed I was distracted, but he just held me tight and promised that whatever was going on, we'd face it together. I didn't call my parents to brag, and I didn't call my brother to gloat. I just stayed in the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, waiting to see what would happen next. The answer arrived right on time, 4 days after Thanksgiving dinner. It was early Monday morning when the phone on my nightstand started buzzing. The caller ID flashed with my father's name, Arthur. Arthur rarely called me directly unless he was issuing a command or expressing disappointment. I answered, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach immediately. "Your grandfather passed away last night," Arthur said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any recognizable human emotion. "He went in his sleep out in Montana. The housekeeper found him this morning. We're arranging a preliminary memorial service at the house in Atherton today. You need to be here before noon, and don't wear that cheap gray coat you wore to Thanksgiving." He hung up before I could even process the words. Harrison was gone. The shock hit me with a delayed physical impact. My grandfather, the man who had just quietly handed out $2,400,000 and watched his family burn 2/3 of it, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. A wave of deep, genuine grief washed over me. He was the only person in this family who possessed even an ounce of integrity. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the tears fall, mourning the fierce, quiet old man who spent his final days on earth, teaching us all a lesson. When I arrived at my parents' mansion in Atherton precisely at noon, the atmosphere was nauseating. The driveway was already packed with luxury cars belonging to event planners and high-end catering companies. There were no quiet mornings, no whispered words of respect or remembrance, no framed photos celebrating Harrison's long, vibrant life. Instead, the house was buzzing with the frantic energy of high society event coordinators setting up a massive dinner party. My mother, Eleanor, was standing in the grand foyer, screaming at a group of florists. She was already dressed in a tailored black designer gown, looking more like she was walking a red carpet than attending a memorial service. "I said white lilies," Eleanor snapped, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a terrified florist holding a massive arrangement. "These have yellow undertones. They will completely clash with the setup at the country club reception. Fix it immediately. Several venture capital titans are attending, and I will not have this family looking like we bought our flowers at a discount grocery store." She spotted me walking through the front door and let out a dramatic sigh, as if my very presence was an unbearable inconvenience. "Chloe, you're finally here," she huffed, adjusting a diamond brooch on her collar. "Go to the dining room and help catering fix the seating chart. I put the top VC partners at table 4, but I need to make sure they are seated next to the Silicon Valley Bank executives. This funeral is an incredible opportunity to leverage everyone's sympathy and push Julian's Series C funding round. Don't mix up the name cards like you did at the charity gala last year." The sheer hypocrisy made my stomach turn. Harrison hadn't even been dead for 24 hours, and Eleanor was already weaponizing his passing for political and social leverage. My mother viewed this funeral as a highly exclusive networking event. She was curating a guest list designed to maximize her social standing, ensuring that the wealthiest and most influential elites in the Bay Area would witness her highly performative grief. I walked past her without saying a word. The house was filled with strangers, staging a lavish spectacle for a man they didn't know and frankly didn't care about. Harrison had despised this kind of pompous display in life. He lived quietly, preferring the company of a good book and a cup of coffee over a room full of arrogant socialites trying to outdress one another. But Eleanor was determined to squeeze every drop of social capital out of her father-in-law's passing, turning a moment of mourning into a highly calculated transaction. I made my way down the long hallway toward the dining room, but stopped when I heard voices coming from my father's private study. The heavy oak door was cracked open. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, holding my breath to listen. Julian was pacing frantically across the Persian rug. The arrogant swagger he displayed at Thanksgiving dinner was completely gone. He sounded desperate, his voice much higher and sharper than usual. "The creditors are breathing down my neck, Dad," Julian said, his footsteps landing with heavy thuds on the hardwood floor. "They're threatening to pull the bridge loan by Friday. If they do, the entire decentralized exchange project collapses instantly. The holding company goes under, and I'll be personally on the hook for massive deficits. I need liquidity right now. I can't wait for a drawn-out probate process." I heard the distinct sound of liquid pouring into a crystal glass. My father spoke, his tone calm and calculating. "Relax, Julian. You're panicking over nothing. Harrison passing away right now is actually the best thing that could have happened for your timeline. The timing is an absolute godsend." I pressed myself against the wall, feeling a fresh wave of disgust. My father was openly calling his own dad's death a convenient financial bailout. "We all know he set up a standard living family trust," Arthur continued, the ice clinking in his glass. "Even with his simple lifestyle, that Montana ranch, his retirement accounts, and whatever cash he quietly stashed away over the last decade, have to be worth at least 4 or 5 million in liquid assets. As his only son, I am the primary executor. The moment the death certificate is filed, I can authorize an emergency bridge injection into your LLC. We can use his estate as collateral to stall your creditors by tomorrow afternoon at the latest." Julian let out a long, shaky exhale, filled with an overwhelming sense of relief. It was so loud it practically echoed in the hallway. Thank God. Seriously, Dad, he finally did something useful for this family. I was looking at total bankruptcy. The SEC is already crawling through my books. Do you think there's any chance he left something to Chloe? I know he always had a bit of a soft spot for her. Arthur let out a harsh, dismissive scoff that made my chest tighten with a very familiar resentment. Absolutely not. Harrison knew Chloe was a hopeless charity case. He wasn't going to waste real capital on a girl who spends her days drawing blueprints in the dirt. Chloe doesn't have the stomach for real wealth. The estate will be split strictly between you and me, as it should be. We'll inject the capital straight into your startup, secure the family legacy, and move forward. This is exactly what we need to get over this hump and shut those pathetic investors up. I stood just outside the study door, listening to them carve up an inheritance they were positive was waiting for them. The arrogance was blinding. They were completely convinced that Harrison had lived a standard upper-middle-class life and left behind a predictable, routine will. They thought his entire net worth was just a few $1 million tied up in Montana real estate and some mutual funds. They had absolutely no idea that the real wealth, the staggering astronomical fortune, had already been handed out. They had no idea that just 4 nights ago, they held their own salvation right in their hands. They laughed at him, called him a senile old fool, and threw $16 million into a blazing fire out of pure, unadulterated ego. And most of all, they definitely didn't expect me to be standing in the hallway, holding the only surviving key to that fortune. I quietly backed away from the study door, my heart pounding with a mix of grief and soaring anticipation. Let them plan, I thought. Let them make false promises to their creditors. Let Eleanor order her expensive white lilies and invite the Silicon Valley elite. Let them put on their sickening, dramatic show of mourning for the entire town. They were building a house of cards on a foundation of pure greed. They saw Harrison's death as a lucky financial breakthrough, a convenient fix for Julian's gross incompetence. They felt so powerful, so certain that their place at the top of the family hierarchy was untouchable. I walked into the dining room as ordered, helping the catering staff arrange the seating chart. I put the venture capital partners exactly where my mother wanted them. I played the role of the quiet, obedient scapegoat perfectly. All afternoon I kept my face blank and my voice low, enduring their sharp commands and dismissive waves. I knew the reading of the will was scheduled for the next day at Harrison's attorney's office in the financial district of San Francisco. I knew they were walking blindly toward a massive cliff. The $24 million was already gone. The liquid estate they were counting on to save Julian from total ruin had been reduced to ash by their own hands. All I had to do was wait for gravity to take over. The day after the funeral arrived, bringing a biting, freezing wind that blew in from the San Francisco Bay, rattling the towering glass windows of the financial district. I took the elevator up to the top floor of one of the city's most prestigious law firms, my hands tucked neatly into the pockets of my dark wool coat. I walked into the spacious reception area of Vance & Associates. The office was an intimidating display of old money and corporate power, featuring dark mahogany-paneled walls, leather seating, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. This was exactly the kind of environment my father, Arthur, worshipped. To him, leather and mahogany signaled obedience and compliance. When I was escorted inside, my parents and brother were already waiting in the private conference room. The air was thick with a palpable, restless greed. There wasn't a single trace of mourning in the room. No one was dabbing their eyes with tissues or sharing fond memories of Harrison. Instead, the energy mirrored the frantic anticipation of lottery winners waiting to claim a jackpot. Julian was pacing back and forth along the long, polished conference table. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit he absolutely couldn't afford, aggressively typing away on his smartphone. I watched him send message after message. No doubt he was texting furious creditors and anxious investors from his failing crypto startup. It was easy to imagine the promises he was making. He was probably assuring them that a massive influx of liquidity would be available within minutes, guaranteeing that the family estate would cover all his outstanding debts and fraudulent bridge loans. His arrogant swagger was fully back, a confidence born from absolute certainty in his upcoming windfall. Arthur sat at the head of the conference table, naturally claiming the seat of absolute authority. He was reviewing spreadsheets on his tablet, checking his heavy gold watch every few minutes with obvious irritation. He wanted the asset transfer done immediately so he could deploy the capital to salvage his son's disastrous business choices. Eleanor sat next to him, complaining to a paralegal about the room temperature and the quality of the espresso she'd just been handed. She treated the legal staff like her personal catering team, completely ignoring the solemn nature of a will reading. I took a seat at the very end of the long table, carefully placing my bag on the floor by my feet. I remained completely silent, offering no greetings and responding to no complaints. I just watched the three of them operate in their bubble of immense privilege. They were so shockingly confident. In their minds, the money was already spent. The heavy door to the conference room swung open, and Ms. Vance walked in. She was a sharp, no-nonsense estate lawyer in her late 60s who had represented Harrison for over 2 decades. She wore a crisp, dark suit and carried only a single, incredibly thin manila folder. Vance possessed a cold, calculating intelligence. She knew my grandfather perfectly, and more importantly, she understood exactly how toxic my father and brother were. As she sat at the opposite end of the table, she offered no fake pleasantries or empty condolences. "Let's get right to it, Vance," Arthur said, his voice commanding as he leaned forward, interlocking his hands on the polished table. "We have a lot of moving parts today. Julian has a major acquisition in the valley that requires an immediate capital injection. I need the liquid assets transferred to my primary holding account before the close of business today, so I can authorize the payments. Skip the red tape and give us the final numbers." Ms. Vance didn't flinch at my father's demanding tone. She calmly adjusted her gold-rimmed glasses and opened the thin folder. She looked at Arthur with zero professional deference, her face a complete blank. Arthur frowned, looking at the single page inside the folder. "Is that a summary? Where is the rest of the documentation? My father's estate should require a comprehensive portfolio index. He had the Montana property, retirement accounts, and mutual funds. I need the complete itemized ledger." "There is no itemized ledger of liquid assets, Arthur," Ms. Vance replied, her voice smooth and incredibly clinical. "Your father updated his last will and testament 5 days before his passing. He severely simplified his estate structure. I will now read the final directive regarding his liquid capital." Julian stopped his pacing, leaning against the glass wall with his arms crossed, wearing a smug, victorious smile. He was ready for his bailout. Eleanor stopped her complaining, leaning in, desperate to hear the exact dollar amount that would elevate her social standing. Ms. Vance cleared her throat and looked directly at my father. She read the remarkably brief document aloud, making sure every syllable carried its full weight. "To my son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren, I have already distributed the entirety of my liquid estate to you on Thanksgiving Day. Whatever you have chosen to do with your inheritance is your own responsibility, and yours alone." Ms. Vance closed the manila folder with a soft, definitive click. She folded her hands precisely over the closed file. "This concludes the reading of the liquid estate distribution," she announced. For 10 agonizing seconds, the room went dead silent. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The words hung in the air like a toxic gas over the mahogany table. The gears in their minds were grinding frantically, desperately trying to process the information. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Julian barked, pushing off the glass wall. His arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a deep, angry confusion. "Distributed on Thanksgiving? He gave us a broken brass key and a useless piece of paper with coordinates on it. That was a senile prank. Stop playing games and read the actual numbers." Ms. Vance looked at Julian with an expression of freezing pity. "That was not a prank, Julian. Those were physical access tokens directly tied to Tier 1 private offshore wealth management accounts. Your grandfather held a highly diversified digital and physical hybrid portfolio that I personally managed for 20 years. The keys and ledger sheets he handed to each of you represented the absolute entirety of his liquid wealth." Arthur's face instantly drained of all color. The ruddy, arrogant flush on his cheeks vanished, leaving a sickly, ash-gray pale. He gripped the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles popped. He stared at Ms. Vance, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. He was a man who prided himself on absolute control, and now he was completely paralyzed by the crashing reality. Eleanor let out a sharp, sudden gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her cheeks. "My God," she whispered, her voice trembling as panic took over. "The key, the note. Arthur." Julian looked like he had been hit squarely in the chest with a sledgehammer. He staggered backward, hitting the glass wall behind him. His eyes were wide, frantic, darting around the room as his brain finally connected the terrifying dots. He looked at the floor, then at his hands, and finally at my father. "The fireplace," Julian choked out, his voice sounding small and completely broken. "The fireplace out back. Dad, we threw them in the fire. The key went down the gas line and the paper burned to ash." The reality of what they had done descended on the room with crushing, destructive weight. They hadn't just lost an inheritance, they had actively physically destroyed it with their own hands. Out of pure spite and untouchable arrogance, they had burned their own salvation to ash. Arthur suddenly bolted upright from his chair, knocking it backward into the thick carpet. "No!" he roared, slamming his fists onto the table. "No, that's impossible. My father didn't have that kind of money. He lived on a broken ranch. He drove an old truck. You're lying. This is a mistake." "It is not a mistake, Arthur," Ms. Vance replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady, completely unfazed by my father's outburst. "Your father was an incredibly brilliant, quiet, invisible investor. He preferred a simple life, but his market instincts were unmatched. What he gave you was entirely real." "How much?" Julian shrieked, taking a threatening step forward toward the attorney. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his expensive suit. His eyes were full of a desperate madness. "How much money did those keys represent? I didn't even look at the numbers on the ledger. How much did we burn?" Ms. Vance adjusted her glasses, locking her eyes onto Julian. "Exactly $24 million. $8 million per person, and just as Harrison explicitly directed, in order to perfectly and legally execute his distribution wishes, those physical tokens were handed directly to each of you. You were given your inheritance. As for your choice to incinerate it, as the will states, the consequences are yours, and yours alone." Julian let out a strange choked sound that was half scream, half sob. He grabbed his hair, pulling violently at the roots as his legs buckled, sending him crashing into his leather chair. He buried his face in his hands. He was finished. The Silicon Valley investors were going to tear him to pieces. The creditors would seize his servers and properties. He had just personally burned $8 million of pure, no-strings-attached salvation. Arthur stood frozen at the head of the table. The great patriarch, the self-proclaimed brilliant corporate attorney, had incinerated a massive fortune simply because he wanted to mock an old man. Absolute humiliation and total financial ruin radiated from him in waves. Eleanor was openly sobbing now. Her face was buried in her incredibly expensive Hermes bag, mourning the money she had treated like garbage just days before. I sat silently at the end of the table, my hands resting neatly in my lap. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched the foundational structure of my toxic family collapse under the weight of their own mind-blowing hubris. The $24 million minus my share was gone. The grand bailout was now nothing more than ash at the bottom of a fireplace back in Atherton. And I was the only person in the room who knew exactly where the only surviving piece of that fortune was sitting. Julian was the first to break the suffocating silence. He bolted upright from his leather chair, slamming his hands flat onto the polished mahogany table. The sudden violence rattled the water pitcher. He leaned aggressively toward Vance, his face twisted into a mask of pure desperation. "Reissue them," Julian demanded, his voice cracking with a frantic, breathless panic. "You're his lawyer. You have the digital signatures. You manage the estate. Reissue a new set of keys right now. Whatever waivers we need to sign, we'll sign them. Just push the paperwork through, Vance." Ms. Vance didn't even blink. She watched Julian with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an insect. "I can't do that, Julian. I do not have the authority to reissue hardware wallets and passphrases, nor do I have access to those specific funds. The physical tokens your grandfather handed to you were the sole legal instruments to transfer the money. They were bearer instruments drawn from a closed offshore trust. Once you destroyed them, you destroyed the only pathway to that capital." "This is completely absurd!" Eleanor shrieked, springing up from her chair, her tear-stained face twisting into a venomous scowl. The performative grief from the funeral was entirely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated greed. My father-in-law was a sick, confused old man. He was 85 years old and completely out of his mind. You cannot legally enforce a distribution of this magnitude when the benefactor is suffering from severe cognitive decline. We will take this to probate court. We will have the entire distribution plan thrown out on grounds of mental incompetence. You are committing malpractice just by entertaining this." Ms. Vance didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into the incredibly thin manila folder and pulled out 3 stapled documents. She slid them smoothly across the long table, stopping them precisely in front of Arthur. I fully expected that reaction from you, Eleanor, Ms. Vance stated, her tone entirely devoid of sympathy. More importantly, Harrison expected it. He knew that the moment his financial decisions didn't align with your interests, you would immediately try to declare him incompetent. Review those documents, Arthur. My father picked up the papers with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the pages rapidly. Those are 3 independent psychiatric evaluations, Ms. Vance explained, leaning back in her chair and interlocking her fingers. They were conducted on November 18th, 19th, and 20th. 3 completely unaffiliated board-certified top psychiatrists spent hours examining your father. They administered rigorous cognitive testing. All 3 signed affidavits stating that Harrison possessed a level of mental clarity sharper than most people half his age. Legally and medically, he was of sound mind, without a shadow of a doubt. If you try to challenge his competency in any court in California, a judge will laugh you out of the room. Arthur dropped the documents back onto the table as if they were burning hot. The fight drained completely out of him. The ruler of the family, the man who controlled every narrative and dictated every financial move, was entirely paralyzed by the absolute flawlessness of his own father's trap. Julian, however, refused to accept defeat. His breathing was fast and shallow, his chest heaving under his custom suit. The arrogant Silicon Valley founder was unraveling right before my eyes, turning into a terrified man facing total financial ruin. "Then where is the money?" Julian shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the empty desktop in front of Ms. Vance. "If the keys are gone, the money in his accounts couldn't have just vanished into thin air. It has to be somewhere. Wire the balance to my business account right now. I'm his grandson. I am the future of this family. That money belongs to me." "The money is gone, Julian," Ms. Vance delivered the final devastating blow with absolute precision. "Your grandfather was an incredibly meticulous planner. He set a strict execution window for this distribution. Any specific funds that failed to be deposited into a verified account within 48 hours of his passing automatically triggered a reversion clause." "What does that mean?" Arthur asked hoarsely, his voice sounding thin and empty. "It means," Ms. Vance continued, "the exact moment the bank was notified of his passing, those unclaimed funds were immediately swept from the trust accounts and absorbed into a blind, irrevocable charitable foundation. The transfer is automatic and permanent. That foundation is managed by an independent board in New York. Those $16 million will be distributed over the next 50 years to various wildlife and literacy charities. You have zero legal recourse. You cannot sue the foundation. You cannot petition the board. The money you burned is permanently out of your reach." The absolute finality of Ms. Vance's words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Every single escape route had been systematically sealed off. There were no legal loopholes, no medical excuses, no hidden secondary accounts waiting to save them. Harrison had locked the doors, boarded up the windows, and watched them light the match themselves. Julian started pacing the room again, but his movements were erratic, losing all of his usual confident stride. He gripped his head, his fingers clawing violently at his hair. He was talking to himself, muttering a frantic stream of numbers and names. I could catch whispers of his creditors, the massive bridge loans, and the venture capital firms expecting returns by the end of the month. He had leveraged everything he owned on the promise of this inheritance. His entire life was built on debt, and the only asset that could save him was currently sitting as ash and melted scrap metal at the bottom of his parents' fireplace. "I'm going to lose everything," Julian gasped, his back hitting the glass wall of the conference room. "The investors are going to seize my startup. They'll take my house. They'll liquidate my personal accounts. I'm completely wiped out." Arthur just sat there, staring blankly at the grain of the mahogany table. He had secretly funneled his own retirement funds into Julian's failing business, risking his own financial security to prop up his golden boy. He had taken out a secret second mortgage on the Atherton mansion behind Eleanor's back, just to keep Julian afloat, fully convinced that Harrison's millions would replenish his accounts. He was drowning right alongside his son. Eleanor kept her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs. She wasn't crying for Harrison. She wasn't mourning a loss. She was mourning the loss of her social standing. She was grieving the country club memberships, the luxury vacations, and the designer clothes that were about to evaporate when the creditors came to collect on Arthur's secret debts. I remained absolutely still at the far end of the table. I kept my breathing slow and rhythmic, maintaining a calm expression of neutral indifference. I was watching a masterclass in karma unfold in real time. For 34 years, I had been the scapegoat of this family. I was dismissed, mocked, and financially cut off because I chose a grounded career in civil engineering instead of participating in their toxic, high-stakes scams. Now, my torturers were burying themselves in their own greed. Julian stopped pacing. He froze near the window, his chest heaving. He stared at the floor, his mind spinning frantically, trying to find an exit, any lifeline that could pull him out of the financial grave he had dug for himself. Then his frantic movement stopped completely. He slowly raised his head. His gaze traveled across the center of the table, past his weeping mother, past his paralyzed father, and slowly extended down the long length of the room. He remembered Thanksgiving night. He remembered the roaring flames, the mocking laughter, the sound of an expensive key being tossed into the abyss. He remembered demanding that I throw my share into the fire. He remembered my quiet refusal. He remembered me folding the paper, placing it along with the key inside my leather bag, and zipping it shut. Julian's bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees instantly. The shift in his expression was immediate and terrifying. The blind panic that had contorted his features violently evolved into a dark, predatory focus. He wasn't looking at his sister anymore. He was looking at a walking, breathing bank vault. Arthur sensed the sudden shift in the air and slowly raised his head. He followed the trajectory of Julian's gaze, his eyes tracking down the length of the table until they landed on me. A second later, a flash of absolute realization hit him. The patriarch's posture straightened, the fog of defeat clearing from his eyes as a desperate, calculating light ignited within them. Eleanor lowered her hands from her tear-stained face. Sniffling, she wiped away her ruined makeup and turned her head to follow her husband's gaze. Now all three pairs of eyes were locked onto me. The silence became heavy and dangerous. Nobody breathed, nobody moved. They were replaying the events of that holiday dinner in their minds, confirming the single, undeniable truth staring back at them. I was the only one who had respected Harrison. I was the only one who walked out of that house with my credentials intact. Under their collective stare, I didn't flinch. My back was perfectly straight, hands resting neatly in my lap. I met Julian's desperate gaze with absolute, unyielding calm. The power dynamics in our family, a rigid hierarchy that had been violently enforced since the day I was born, shattered into a million pieces in an instant. The golden boy was broke. The wealthy patriarch was drowning in secret debt. The image-obsessed mother was facing total social ruin. And sitting at the end of the table, the invisible, disappointing daughter held $8 million in cleared, verified, no-strings-attached cash. Julian took a slow, deliberate step toward me, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The desperation in his eyes had been completely replaced by a sickening, entitled expectation. The real war was no longer about the money they had burned. It was about the money they were now absolutely certain belonged to them. The frantic pounding on my door started at exactly 6:30 the following evening. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing final bridge stress test data on my laptop, while my fiancé Marcus was making dinner. The slamming against the door was urgent and aggressive. Our building didn't have a doorman, and whoever was outside had clearly slipped in behind another tenant. Marcus and I locked eyes. He slowly wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, his jaw tight. I pulled up the security camera feed on my phone. Standing in the hallway, glaring directly into the camera lens, were my parents, Arthur and Eleanor. "Let them in," I told Marcus, my voice steady. "Better to just handle this right now." The moment Marcus opened the door, Arthur pushed past him, striding into our living room with an arrogance that implied he owned the space just by standing in it. Eleanor followed closely behind, her eyes darting around the cozy, unpretentious apartment, mentally cataloging everything we owned with quiet judgment. Neither of them acknowledged Marcus. They didn't take off their coats. They marched straight to the kitchen island where I was sitting. Arthur didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. He slammed a heavy leather portfolio down onto the countertop right next to my laptop. The thud made my coffee mug rattle. "We need to resolve this immediately," Arthur said, his tone commanding, though his voice sounded tight and a bit breathless. He was wearing the exact same suit from the attorney's office the day before, and he looked completely exhausted. "I have the wire transfer routing codes for Julian's primary business account right here. I've already spoken with my firm's corporate attorneys, and we've drafted a family asset restructuring agreement. I need you to initiate a wire transfer for exactly $6 million by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I stared at the leather folder, then slowly raised my eyes to look at my father. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. You barge into my building uninvited, hand me a piece of paper, and demand I wire $6 million to my brother? This is not a request, Chloe, Arthur snapped, his face flushing with instant irritation. This is a necessary reallocation of family assets. Harrison made a catastrophic error trying to distribute his wealth without consulting me. He was clearly suffering from cognitive decline and created a massive logistical nightmare. Now we have to clean up his mess. Julian's company defaults on its bridge loan this Friday. If we don't inject liquidity into his holding firm immediately, the venture capital investors will pull their funding and seize the collateral. The family's reputation is on the line. I am giving you the directive to fix this. You're giving me a directive? I repeated, shaking my head in sheer disbelief. Dad, this money is mine. It's in my private account. It isn't family capital. You have absolutely zero authority over it. Eleanor let out a sharp, theatrical sigh and stepped forward, placing her hands flat on the counter. She tried to use her soothing, maternal voice, a tone she only deployed when she was attempting to manipulate someone into submission. Chloe, honey, you need to be reasonable, Eleanor said, her eyes wide with a mask of fake concern. You are completely overwhelmed by this situation, and you aren't thinking clearly. We understand this is a lot of money, and we don't expect you to give it all up. We are more than willing to let you keep $2 million. That is an extraordinary amount of money for someone like you. You can buy a nice little house and invest the rest into your little bridge-building hobby. My little bridge-building hobby? I countered, feeling a familiar spark of anger ignite in my chest. Yes, Eleanor continued, completely oblivious to my rising fury. You draw lines on a computer, Chloe. It's cute, but it's not a real business. Julian is building a decentralized financial empire. He is developing platforms. He is establishing our family legacy. You cannot possibly understand the immense pressure he is under. He has massive overhead and aggressive investors. He needs that capital to secure his blueprint. You don't need $8 million to live your quiet little life. Families require sacrifice. It is time for you to step up and do the right thing for your brother. I looked at my mother, seeing her for exactly who she was. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was demanding my compliance. She genuinely believed that my entire existence, my financial security, and my autonomy should be happily sacrificed to prop up her golden boy's disastrous failures. You want me to sacrifice my inheritance to save Julian? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Exactly, Arthur chimed in, leaning heavily against the counter. We knew you'd understand once we explained the stakes. I'll call your wealth manager first thing in the morning to authorize the transfer on your behalf. I slowly slid the leather portfolio back across the countertop, straight toward my father. No, I said. Arthur froze. His hand hovered in midair as he reached for the folder. He stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. What did you say? He demanded. I said no, I repeated, enunciating every word with absolute clarity. I am not wiring $6 million to Julian. I wouldn't give him $6. I am not giving either of you a single penny. An absolute suffocating silence fell over the kitchen. Marcus stood quietly near the stove, forming an unstated physical barrier between me and the hallway. Arthur's face turned a deep, furious crimson. Chloe, you will do exactly what I tell you to do, he roared, slamming his fist onto the countertop. You are my daughter. You do not dictate financial policy in this family. That money was supposed to belong to Julian anyway. Harrison was senile and made a mistake. You are going to correct it right now. He wasn't senile, Dad, I shot back, rising from my chair to match his volume. He was brilliant. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew you and Julian were arrogant, greedy, and completely self-absorbed. He handed you your inheritance on a silver platter. You physically held $8 million in your hands, both of you. And what did you do? I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the island, locking my eyes onto my father's. You threw it in the fireplace because you wanted to mock him. You burned your own salvation to ash because your egos were too massive to accept a gift from an old man you considered beneath you. Do not speak to me that way, Arthur yelled, pointing a trembling finger in my face. I will speak to you however I want. I snapped, refusing to back down. You made your choice. You burned your bailout. You burned Julian's safety net. You burned the precious family reputation you care so much about. And now you expect me to clean up your mess? You expect me to hand over the only surviving piece of that fortune just because I was the only person at that table who showed a shred of basic human respect? The answer is absolutely not. You will never see a dime of this money. It is mine and it is locked down tight. Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical gasp. She stumbled back from the counter, clutching her expensive handbag tightly to her chest. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The maternal manipulation was completely gone, replaced by absolute rage. "You selfish little traitor," Eleanor screamed, her high-pitched voice echoing through the apartment. "You ungrateful, spiteful little brat. We gave you everything. We clothed you, we fed you, we raised you. And the moment you get a taste of real money, you turn on your own blood. You are doing this purely out of jealousy, deliberately trying to destroy your brother. You have always hated him because he is better than you, because he is successful, and you are just a pathetic little laborer." "He isn't successful, Mom," I fired back, the truth hitting the room like a physical blow. "He's broke. He's a fraud. He's been stringing investors along for years with fake promises, and now his house of cards is collapsing. And you, to protect your image at the country club, are desperate enough to rob your own daughter just to keep his lie alive." "How dare you!" Arthur roared, his body jerking forward aggressively. Marcus stepped in front of the island instantly, blocking my father's path. "That's enough," Marcus declared, his voice deep, low, and completely unyielding. "You both need to leave. Right now." Arthur stopped, glaring at Marcus with absolute contempt. "Stay out of this. This is a family matter." "Not anymore," Marcus replied. "Chloe already gave you her answer. The money is hers. Now get out of our home, or I'll call building security and have you removed for trespassing." Arthur stared at Marcus, his chest heaving. He turned his eyes back to me, and the pure hatred in his gaze sent a brief chill down my spine. That wasn't the look of a father looking at his child. That was a cornered predator looking at an obstacle. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life, Chloe," Arthur hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, threatening whisper. "You think you can steal my family's legacy and just walk away? You have no idea what I'm capable of. I will make sure you lose every single penny. I will ruin you." He snatched the leather portfolio from the counter and spun around. "Let's go, Eleanor, we're done here." Eleanor glared at me, her eyes filling with toxic, angry tears. "You are dead to me," she spat, her voice shaking. "Don't you ever call me again." They stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard the picture frames on the hallway walls rattled. I stood in the kitchen, my heart pounding, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline faded. I had done it. For the first time in 34 years, I looked my parents in the eye and absolutely refused to back down to their abuse. Marcus threw his arms around me, pulling me into a tight, protective embrace. He buried his face in my hair, holding me steady as I processed what had just happened. "You were incredible," he whispered, kissing the top of my head. "You drew the line. You held the ground." I held him back, pressing my forehead against his chest. It felt like I had just survived a major earthquake. The initial shockwave was over, but the structural damage was permanent. I had drawn a line in the sand, and I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that my father wasn't bluffing. He was coming for me. The war was officially on. The very next morning, before the sun had even fully risen to illuminate the San Francisco skyline, the retaliation began. I was standing in the kitchen pouring my first cup of coffee when Marcus's phone started buzzing on the island. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. It was an unknown number, but the area code was from the wealthy suburb of Atherton where my parents lived. Marcus answered and put it on speaker so I could hear. "Marcus, dear, it's Eleanor." My mother's voice came through the speaker. It was sickeningly sweet, laced with a calculated motherly tremor of anxiety. "I know things got emotional last night, but I'm calling because I am truly, deeply terrified for Chloe." Marcus leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "What exactly are you terrified of, Eleanor?" he asked, his tone perfectly polite but devoid of any warmth. My mother let out a rehearsed, fragile sigh. "Chloe is sick, Marcus. She has always struggled with this emotional instability and extreme greed, but this time she has gone too far. She manipulated my poor, demented father-in-law. Harrison had no idea what he was signing in his final days, and Chloe took advantage of a cognitively declining old man to steal Julian's startup capital. She robbed her own family. Marcus, I'm telling you this because I care about you. You are about to marry a woman who is currently committing elder abuse and financial fraud. When the police get involved, she is going to drag you down with her." I froze, the coffee pot trembling in my hand. The audacity of her trying to poison the only person standing between me and their rage was unbelievable. She was actively trying to frame me as a criminal to my own fiancé. Marcus didn't hesitate for a single second. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, uncompromising register, "I was standing right next to Chloe last night when you and Arthur barged into our home. I heard you demand she hand over her money to bail out your bankrupt golden boy. Don't ever call my phone again to peddle your pathetic lies. If you or your husband attempt to contact me, I will file for a harassment restraining order." He ended the call and blocked the number immediately. He looked up at me with a reassuring smile, but I could feel a cold dread pooling in my stomach. If my mother was willing to call Marcus, she wasn't going to stop there. My fears were confirmed exactly 3 hours later. I was sitting at my desk at the engineering firm, reviewing structural steel wireframes for a bridge, when my office phone rang. It was the administrative assistant to the VP of Human Resources, requesting my immediate presence on the top floor. I walked into the spacious corner office to find the VP standing behind her desk, looking extremely uncomfortable. "Chloe, please take a seat," she instructed, gesturing to a chair. "I received a highly concerning phone call this morning from a woman claiming to be your mother. She alleges that you are currently the subject of an active criminal investigation regarding grand larceny and financial fraud against the elderly. She claims you stole $24 million from a cognitively impaired older relative." The sheer ruthlessness of Eleanor's attack hit me like a physical blow. She was actively trying to destroy my career. She wanted to strip away the independent life I had built for myself, leaving me with no choice but to crawl back to them. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to rest calmly on my lap. I looked the VP directly in the eye. "My mother is lying," I stated with absolute clarity. "My grandfather recently passed away and legally left a portion of his estate to me. My family is attempting to contest the distribution because my brother is currently facing total bankruptcy. They demanded I give them the money last night, and I refused. There is no criminal investigation. I have broken no laws. This is a malicious smear campaign designed to intimidate me into handing over my inheritance." The VP let out a long breath, visibly relaxing. "I figured as much, given your flawless record here. But company policy dictates I must inquire when such serious allegations are reported. I will log this as a family dispute and instruct the front desk to block any calls claiming to be from your relatives. Your position is entirely secure, Chloe." I thanked her and went back to my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had survived the workplace ambush, but Eleanor was just getting started. By noon, the isolation tactics were deployed with terrifying efficiency. My personal phone began to vibrate non-stop. First came the texts, then it escalated into an endless bombardment of voicemails and social media notifications. My parents had mobilized the extended family and their wealthy country club social circles. They had spun a narrative portraying Julian as the hard-working victim, and me as a greedy, manipulative villain who swooped in to rob a dying old man. I opened my phone to a text from my Aunt Martha. "How could you do this to your own brother? He has a company to run, and you stole his inheritance to fund your selfish lifestyle. You are a monster." Next was a voicemail from a family friend I'd known since childhood. "Chloe, we are all so disappointed in you. Your mother is completely devastated. Return the money you stole before you end up in legal trouble. You are a gold digger tearing your own family apart." The messages flooded in, a wave of venomous judgment from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. Cousins, uncles, family acquaintances. They swallowed Eleanor's story completely without asking a single question. I was bombarded with words like thief, sociopath, and traitor. They blamed me for ruining my brother's life. They claimed I was dancing on my grandfather's grave. The psychological warfare was immediate and devastating. I sat in a cubicle in the company restroom, gripping my phone, reading one hateful message after another. It's one thing to know your parents are toxic, but watching them successfully convince dozens of people that you are a monster is a whole different level of trauma. The sheer volume of hatred made me start to question my own sanity. I felt the walls closing in. This social suffocation was designed to break my spirit, to make me feel so absolutely isolated and despised that I would hand over the money just to make the pain stop. I left work early, unable to focus on physical load calculations while my character was being publicly assassinated. When I walked through the apartment door, Marcus took one look at my pale face and went into action. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me to just ignore them. He recognized that we were under siege, and he treated it like a tactical defense operation. "Give me the phone," Marcus ordered gently but firmly, taking the device from my trembling hands. "You are not looking at this anymore." He sat me on the couch, wrapping a thick blanket around my shoulders, and went straight to work at the kitchen island. For the next 4 hours, he sat there, systematically documenting every single instance of harassment. He took screenshots of every hateful text. He saved every threatening voicemail. He logged the names and timestamps of social media comments attacking my character. He was building an ironclad file of evidence. Once the data was secure, he ruthlessly blocked every offending number. He locked down my social media profiles, setting everything to the highest privacy restrictions. He built a digital fortress around me, cutting off their avenues of attack. I sat on the couch, feeling incredibly small. The mental strain was testing the absolute limits of my resilience. The tiny voice of self-doubt that my parents had spent 34 years cultivating in my mind began to whisper. Maybe I should just give them the money. Maybe $4 million was worth it for the piece. Maybe I really was ruining the family. Marcus came over, sitting beside me and pulling me into his chest. I confessed my self-doubt to him, my voice cracking under the immense weight. I asked him if fighting this war was really worth the emotional destruction. Marcus lifted my chin, forcing me to look into his steady, reassuring eyes. "Chloe, listen to me carefully," he said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "They are doing this because they are terrified. They are using social pressure because they have absolutely zero legal leverage. If they had a real case, they would have sent a lawyer, not your Aunt Martha with an angry text. They want you to break because they know it's the only way they win." He picked up the thick printed folder of screenshots he had compiled and set it on the coffee table. "Every single message in this file is proof of their desperation," Marcus continued. "Your mother is burning her own dignity to ash just to scare you. Don't let her win. You earned your peace, you earned your freedom, and your grandfather made sure you have the armor to protect it." His unwavering support was the anchor I desperately needed. Marcus wasn't intimidated by their wealth or their country club connections. He saw right through the emotional manipulation and the smear campaign. In his arms, the overwhelming weight of the isolation began to lift. I wasn't alone. I had a partner who was completely willing to stand in the fire with me. I stared at the thick file of screenshots on the coffee table. My mother thought she could use social pressure to force me into submission. She thought she could isolate me and tear down my reputation until I broke, but she completely misjudged my strength. I was no longer the quiet, submissive scapegoat who would just sit back and take their abuse. I was a woman holding the keys to an empire, and I was done playing defense. This smear campaign had tested my psychological limits, but it had also forged my resolve into absolute steel. I was ready to fight back. The fallout from the confrontation at my apartment came with terrifying speed. My father had threatened to ruin me, and he possessed both the capital and the pure, vindictive will to execute that threat with military precision. I had expected nasty phone calls from distant relatives or a dramatic disownment letter. What I never saw coming was being ambushed outside my office building at 8 o'clock in the morning by a process server. I was holding a cup of coffee, walking toward the revolving glass doors of my building, when a man in a beige trench coat stepped directly into my path. He confirmed my name, shoved a thick manila envelope into my hands, and walked away without saying a word. I stood on the sidewalk, the freezing morning wind whipping against my face, and tore the envelope open. It was an emergency application for a temporary restraining order, combined with a petition for an adult conservatorship, filed in the Superior Court of California. The petitioner was Julian. The respondent was me. The allegations listed at the top of the paperwork made my blood run cold. Financial elder abuse and fraudulent inducement. Julian wasn't just suing me for the money. He was actively trying to destroy my entire life by launching a civil suit with massive criminal implications. The paperwork alleged that I had spent months manipulating a vulnerable 85-year-old man, systematically isolating him from his loving family to orchestrate the theft of his entire liquid estate. The narrative they spun was a masterpiece of pure fiction, painting me as a calculating predator who swooped in during Harrison's final days to rob my brother of his rightful inheritance. I rushed up to my office, locked the door, and frantically flipped through the attached evidence. At the absolute core of their lawsuit was a sworn medical affidavit. The signer was a Dr. Aris, a prominent concierge physician based in Beverly Hills. I recognized the name immediately. Dr. Eris was a regular guest at my parents' charity galas and a frequent golfing partner of my father. The affidavit was devastating. Dr. Eris claimed that he had informally evaluated Harrison during a family gathering on November 23rd, just 5 days before Thanksgiving. He swore under oath that Harrison showed severe signs of late-stage Lewy body dementia, profound disorientation, and a total inability to comprehend basic financial concepts. He concluded that on the day Harrison distributed the bank vault keys, he was entirely incapable of making independent legal or financial decisions. It was a blatant, fabricated lie. Harrison hadn't attended a single one of my parents' dinner parties in over 3 years, specifically because he despised their social circle. The document was completely backdated, a piece of manufactured evidence my father had paid for to give Julian the legal leverage he desperately needed. But to a judge looking at a sworn affidavit from a respected medical professional, it was enough to trigger immediate legal action. I pulled out my phone to call Marcus when a notification flashed across the screen. It was an alert from my banking app. I tapped the icon to open my account, but the login screen froze. A bold red message appeared across the interface. Access to your accounts has been temporarily suspended due to a court-ordered asset freeze. Panic. A cold, sharp knife of absolute terror pierced my chest. I tried logging into my business account, the one I used to pay for my engineering software subscriptions and freelance contractor fees. Frozen. I tried my personal savings, money I had earned over years of working grueling 60-hour weeks. Frozen. I even tried my basic checking account, the one I used to buy groceries. Frozen. Julian and my father hadn't just frozen the $8 million, they had weaponized the emergency restraining order to freeze every single financial asset tied to my name. They had effectively locked me out of my own life. I couldn't access the inheritance, but worse, I couldn't access the money I actually needed to survive. They were trying to starve me out. They wanted me to feel the exact same desperate, suffocating panic that Julian was currently facing with his creditors. I called Mr. Sterling at the bank vault, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. He answered immediately, his voice heavy with professional regret. "Chloe, I am so incredibly sorry," Mr. Sterling said before I could even ask. "We received the court order an hour ago. We are legally obligated to comply with the asset freeze pending a preliminary hearing. I cannot authorize any payments, not even for basic living expenses. Your brother's legal team filed an extremely aggressive motion claiming you are a flight risk." "How long is this going to last?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How am I supposed to pay rent? How am I supposed to buy food?" "The preliminary hearing is set for 2 weeks from now," Mr. Sterling replied, his tone filled with deep sympathy. "Until a judge reviews the evidence and makes a ruling, your assets are completely locked. I strongly advise you to secure legal representation immediately, Chloe. Your family isn't playing games. They are trying to bury you alive." I hung up, feeling completely disarmed. I was 34 years old, making a generous executive salary, and suddenly I didn't even have the funds to buy a lunch sandwich. My father had promised to ruin me, and he had executed the first strike flawlessly. He knew I prided myself on my fierce independence. By freezing my hard-earned money, he was trying to humiliate me and force me into a state of total dependence. I called Marcus, crying tears of pure frustration as I explained the situation. He was furious, but he didn't panic. He told me to come home immediately. By the time I walked through the door, he had his laptop open and a notebook out. "They want you to feel helpless," Marcus said, pulling me into his arms. "But you aren't. My accounts aren't frozen. My salary is completely fine. We will use my money to pay the rent, buy the food, and cover the bills. You are not going to starve, and you are absolutely not going to surrender. We are going to win this." His unwavering support steadied me, but the reality of the legal battle hung over us like a dark cloud. I was facing a protracted, incredibly expensive lawsuit against a family with near-limitless resources. Arthur had the financial power to drag me through years of litigation, draining me with exorbitant legal fees, until I was forced to settle just to survive. They had a corrupt doctor willing to commit perjury, and I had nothing but a brass key, a note, and my own word. I needed a lawyer, but the cruel irony was that I couldn't access my own funds to pay a retainer. I felt trapped in a beautifully designed legal cage. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, running through every possible scenario in my mind, searching for a weakness in their attack. Then, I remembered the name on the manila folder from the will reading at the attorney's office. Ms. Vance. She was Harrison's trust lawyer. She was the one who had read the terms of the will to my father. She was the one who understood exactly what my grandfather had planned. Most importantly, she had defended Harrison's mental capacity with absolute conviction. I pulled up her contact information from the business card she had handed me. I called her office, fully expecting to be brushed off by a receptionist or told she couldn't represent me due to a conflict of interest. Instead, the receptionist kept me on hold for less than 30 seconds before Ms. Vance herself picked up the line. "Chloe," Ms. Vance said, her voice crisp and professional. "I was wondering how long it would take Arthur to execute the asset freeze. I assume he filed the restraining order this morning." "You knew this was going to happen?" I asked, gripping the phone tight. "Your father is an incredibly predictable man," Ms. Vance replied dryly. "Arthur plays chess like a blunt instrument, trying to smash pieces off the board with brute force. Harrison, however, was playing a game they couldn't even comprehend. He anticipated this exact sequence of moves, Chloe. He knew that the moment they realized they had burned their inheritance, they would attempt to weaponize the legal system against you. He predicted the restraining order, the fraudulent medical claims, and the asset freeze. He knew exactly what kind of predictable, greedy monsters his son and grandson were." I stared at the wall, trying to process the absolute calm in her voice. If he knew they would do this, why did he even distribute those vault keys? Why not just wire the money or leave it in a standard living trust? "Because those 3 keys in the ledgers were never just a financial distribution," Ms. Vance explained, and the feeling of her leaning forward came through the line, her tone becoming sharp and serious. "They were a character test. Harrison was reaching the end of his life, and he needed to know who was worthy of holding the keys to his empire. He understood the dynamic of the golden boy in your family. He watched Arthur and Eleanor spend decades diminishing your accomplishments while funneling endless capital into Julian's disastrous failures. The Thanksgiving dinner was a psychological evaluation. He gave everyone an equal share of pure, unadulterated salvation. He wanted to see who had the humility to accept it and who had the arrogance to destroy it." "He knew they would burn it?" I asked, a chill running down my spine at the realization. "He highly suspected they would," Ms. Vance corrected, "but he needed them to execute that destruction with their own hands. By throwing those brass keys into the fire, Arthur and Julian voluntarily relinquished their legal recourse to his liquid estate. They cannot argue that Harrison cut them out of the will. Harrison handed them millions on a silver platter, and they chose to burn it. It is a brilliant, ironclad legal trap specifically designed to filter out the arrogant. You were the only person at that table who showed him a shred of basic human respect. You kept the key. You passed the test, Chloe." "But passing the test just got my entire life locked down," I countered, the panic from earlier creeping back into my throat. "I can't fight a protracted war of attrition against my father. He'll drain me with legal fees until I'm forced to surrender. I can't even afford to retain you." Ms. Vance let out a brief, sharp laugh on the other end of the line. "Chloe, you don't need to retain me. I am already working for you. I've reviewed the restraining order. Dr. Eris's affidavit is a masterpiece of pure fiction." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I need you in my office tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Ms. Vance continued. "Use the delivery entrance in the back alley of the building to avoid any private investigators your father might have hired. We have an immense amount of work to do. It's time for you to see what Harrison was putting in place while your family was busy underestimating him." I hung up the phone, a fresh spark of defiant hope igniting in my chest. Arthur and Julian thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought freezing my bank accounts would break my spirit. They had absolutely no idea that Harrison had planned for this exact moment, leaving me the keys to a kingdom they knew nothing about. The trap had indeed been sprung, but I wasn't the one caught inside it. The next morning, I braced myself against the freezing San Francisco wind, pulling my wool coat tight around my shoulders. Following Ms. Vance's precise instructions, I bypassed the grand revolving glass doors of her firm's building and slipped down a narrow delivery alley. I found the unmarked internal service elevator she had mentioned. A security guard expecting my arrival nodded silently, swiping an access card to send me directly to the executive floor. I stepped into a quiet, dimly lit corridor, completely invisible to the public or any private investigators my father might have stationed in the main lobby. Ms. Vance was waiting for me in a private boardroom at the end of the hall, a space entirely isolated from the rest of the bustling firm. She sat at a round marble table, 2 steaming cups of black coffee resting on the polished surface. She looked remarkably relaxed, reading through a leather-bound dossier with the demeanor of someone holding all the winning cards. "Take a seat, Chloe," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "I trust your arrival went unnoticed." "I think so," I replied, sitting down and wrapping my cold hands around the warm coffee mug. "But Ms. Vance, they've frozen everything. My personal savings, my business accounts. Julian filed a restraining order alleging elder abuse. They even got Dr. Eris to sign an affidavit claiming my grandfather was incompetent. I have absolutely no way to access the $8 million or my own salary." Ms. Vance took a slow sip of her coffee. She didn't look surprised or concerned. A faint, knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Your father is an aggressive man, but he suffers from a severe lack of imagination," Ms. Vance stated, setting her cup down. "He believes that if he applies enough financial pressure, you will simply hand over the $8 million to avoid a legal battle. He thinks that $8 million is the entire prize. He thinks he's frozen your only weapon. He doesn't understand that the liquid cash is merely the tip of the iceberg." Ms. Vance opened the thick leather dossier. Inside was a massive stack of corporate registrations, offshore holding agreements, and digitally signed stock certificates. "Your grandfather was not just a retired logistics coordinator living quietly in Montana," Ms. Vance continued, her voice dropping to a low, reverent tone. "Harrison was a silent titan in the digital infrastructure and server hosting sector. He operated entirely through proxy corporations and blind trusts. He possessed massive capital and an absolute genius for the underlying architecture of technology. Over the past decade, he kept a close eye on Julian's highly publicized tech startup. He watched Julian make incredibly reckless, highly leveraged decisions. I looked down at the documents, recognizing the names of several decentralized network projects Julian had bragged about over the years. When traditional Silicon Valley banks cut Julian off due to his disastrous risk profile, he sought bridge financing from private venture infrastructure syndicates, Ms. Vance explained. He needed massive injections of cash at predatory interest rates just to keep his servers running and his platforms online. He believed he was securing credit and server resources from a hard-nosed, anonymous infrastructure syndicate based out of New York called Ironclad Data Holdings. Ms. Vance paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment to ensure I understood the gravity of what she was about to say. "He was actually borrowing server capacity and computing power from Harrison," Ms. Vance declared. I caught my breath. My eyes darted from the paperwork to Ms. Vance, completely stunned. "Harrison was the shadow infrastructure provider," I whispered, my mind racing. "He held the physical underlying framework of Julian's entire platform?" Ms. Vance nodded, a sharp, triumphant light gleaming in her eyes. "The absolute lifeblood of Julian's entire cryptocurrency exchange, every single server hosting their algorithms, is heavily collateralized to Ironclad Data Holdings, and that company is 100% owned and operated by your grandfather. Harrison was his largest creditor. Every server room Julian currently rents, every patent on code he put up as collateral, belongs to Harrison if he defaults. And as we both know, Julian is facing an imminent default. He needed that $6 million he demanded from you last night to pay for the bandwidth and server leases he owes to the very old man he mocked." The sheer, breathtaking poetic justice of my grandfather's plan hit me like a freight train. Julian had spent years strutting around Silicon Valley, acting like a tech visionary, completely oblivious to the fact that his elderly grandfather held the leash. He had personally thrown an $8 million vault key into the fire, the very key that could have cleared his debts to Harrison. Now he was broke, legally trapped and completely exposed. "But Harrison is gone," I pointed out, gesturing to the files. "What happens to Ironclad Data Holdings now?" Ms. Vance slid the heavy leather dossier directly across the marble table until it rested right in front of me. She pulled a sleek silver pen from her breast pocket and placed it on top of the files. "That brings us to the secondary documentation your grandfather signed 3 days before his passing," Ms. Vance said. "He instituted a strict succession plan for this holding company, entirely contingent on the outcome of the Thanksgiving test. If you had burned your key, Ironclad Data Holdings would have been dissolved, its assets donated to charity. Because you kept the key and verified it, the contingency mechanism was triggered." I stared at the thick stack of legal documents, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Chloe," Ms. Vance said, her voice carrying absolute, undeniable authority. "You are not just the beneficiary of an $8 million fund. As of this morning, the legal equity transfer is complete. You are now the sole controlling manager and majority shareholder of Ironclad Data Holdings. You possess the absolute authority to call in Julian's debts. You possess the power to cut off his servers. You hold the entire fate of the Atherton legacy in the palm of your hand." I reached out, touching the leather cover of the dossier. My fingers trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear. The feeling rushing through my veins was raw, pure power. For 34 years, my parents and brother had made me feel small, insignificant, and helpless. They had bullied me, diminished my profession, and demanded my absolute compliance. They thought freezing my personal bank accounts would break my spirit and force me to capitulate. Instead, they had inadvertently forced me to inherit the weapon that would utterly dismantle them. "We have already filed an emergency counter motion against Arthur and Julian," Ms. Vance informed me, leaning back in her chair. "This afternoon, we will present the judge with irrefutable evidence regarding that fraudulent medical affidavit. Your personal accounts will be unfrozen within 48 hours. But more importantly, we are going to use your authority as his primary creditor to launch a highly aggressive forensic audit of Julian's corporate financials. Your father has been desperately hiding something in those books, and we are going to drag it into the light of day." I picked up the silver pen, feeling its cold weight in my hand. I flipped open the dossier, looking at the signature line that would authorize my takeover of the holding company. I remembered the arrogant smirk on my brother's face as he tore up his ledger sheet and tossed his key into the fire. I remembered my mother screaming at me, calling me a selfish traitor. I remembered my father threatening to ruin my life if I didn't bow to his demands. They wanted a war. They wanted to show me what they were capable of when challenged. I signed my name on the dotted line, bold and decisive. I closed the folder and slid it back to Ms. Vance. "Let's go audit my brother," I said, my voice completely stripped of the timid girl they thought they knew. "It's time to show them exactly who controls this family now." Ms. Vance wasted absolutely no time. Within 48 hours, she had the emergency counter motion resting on the desk of a California Superior Court judge. She didn't just contest the freezing of my personal accounts, she presented irrefutable evidence linking Dr. Eris directly to my father. She submitted country club logs showing their weekly golf games, alongside financial records proving a massive, anonymous donation my father had recently made to Dr. Eris's private medical aesthetics clinic. Tehi Judge was absolutely furious. Weaponizing the court system with a fraudulent medical affidavit was an incredibly severe offense. The judge immediately threw out Julian's restraining order, unfroze my personal assets, and granted me full, unrestricted access to the operating accounts of Ironclad Data Holdings. The moment the funds officially cleared and I took the helm of Harrison's empire, I authorized my very first executive expense. I directed Ms. Vance to retain the most ruthless forensic accounting firm in San Francisco. She brought in a man named Vargas. He didn't wear flashy suits or boast about his high-profile victories. He was a quiet, terrifyingly methodical man who examined corporate ledgers the way a surgeon reviews an MRI. He lived for the thrill of dissecting financial lies. Vance, Vargas, and I sat in the firm's private conference room as I pushed over the complete documentation of the massive debt Julian owed to Ironclad Data Holdings. As the primary creditor controlling his entire digital infrastructure, I possessed the absolute legal right to demand an immediate, comprehensive audit of his business operations. Julian had signed ironclad covenants when leasing his server capacity, blindly agreeing to total financial transparency in the event of an imminent default. The very next morning, we served the audit demand to Julian's cryptocurrency startup. I could only imagine the absolute panic that erupted inside his lavish Silicon Valley headquarters. His legal team desperately filed pathetic motions for a delay, claiming that their financial records were undergoing an internal compliance review and couldn't be securely transferred. Ms. Vance shattered every single motion before lunch. We delivered a final ultimatum. If he failed to hand over access to his digital ledgers by the close of business, we would immediately cut the physical connection to every single one of his servers. Faced with the instant destruction of his online platform and total exposure, Julian capitulated. He surrendered the encryption keys to his cloud ledgers. Vance's office became a war room. For 3 straight days and nights, Vargas and his team of analysts worked around the clock, stripping away the layers of Julian's accounting software. Marcus utilized his cybersecurity expertise to assist Vargas, tracing hidden transactions buried behind digital obfuscation tools and asset mixers. We kept them fueled with coffee, watching as they systematically dismantled the illusion of the great Silicon Valley tech prodigy. It wasn't just a case of poor business management, it was a masterpiece of financial fraud. On the third night, Vargas called me into the war room. The walls were covered in massive whiteboards displaying a dizzying complex web of corporate entities, shell companies, and offshore digital wallets. Vargas pointed a marker at the center of the diagram, right at Julian's primary trading platform. "Your brother isn't a tech entrepreneur," Vargas stated, his voice flat and steady. "He's running a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme." Vargas explained that whenever Julian secured a fresh round of funding from capital firms to develop his disruptive algorithms, the money never actually went toward research and development. Instead, he immediately routed the capital through a maze of shell companies to pay off furious early investors from his previous failed ventures. It was a classic high-stakes shell game disguised in expensive suits and sleek pitch decks. He used aggressive leverage to blind his victims, promising astronomical returns while secretly draining their initial investments to cover his massive outstanding liabilities. The underlying node acquisition initiative he had proudly bragged about at Thanksgiving dinner was a complete black hole. Vargas pulled up the data hosting bills and independent contractor invoices. Julian hadn't written a single line of viable code. The entire platform was rotting from the inside out, while he continued to collect millions in bridge loans to fund an incredibly extravagant lifestyle. He was using stolen user deposits and investor capital to lease his Porsche, rent his high-end office spaces, and pay his expensive country club dues. But the deception didn't stop with Julian. Vargas walked over to another whiteboard, tapping his marker heavily against a series of massive cash injections that had miraculously saved Julian's company from bankruptcy 6 months prior. These equity injections didn't come from external venture capital firms, Vargas stated, his tone deadly serious. Ironclad Data Holdings was pressing him for the overdue server rent, and he had run out of new victims to scam. So he turned to the only person arrogant and blind enough to bail him out: your father. I stared at the staggering numbers written in red ink. I knew Arthur had been propping Julian up, but the sheer scale of the financial transfer was unbelievable. "Where did my father get that kind of liquid capital?" I asked, a knot tightening in my stomach. "He didn't have it," Vargas replied bluntly. "Arthur drained his entire corporate retirement investment portfolio. He cashed out every safe investment he had accumulated over 40 years of practice. He liquidated mutual funds and absorbed massive early withdrawal penalties. But even that wasn't enough to plug the holes in Julian's sinking ship. So Arthur got desperate. Vargas picked up a thick stack of real estate deed registries from the table and handed them to me. I looked down at the documents, recognizing the address instantly. It was my parents' sprawling mansion in Atherton, the glass-walled estate where I had spent my entire childhood enduring their relentless emotional abuse. The home that was supposed to have been completely paid off years ago. "Your father took out 3 secret, highly leveraged second mortgages against the family estate," Vargas explained, "and he committed federal fraud to do it. The property is jointly owned by both your parents." Arthur forged Eleanor's signature on the loan documents, bypassing her authorization completely. He stripped every single dollar of equity out of that house and threw it straight into Julian's fraudulent shell company. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy. My father, the man who constantly lectured me on financial responsibility, the man who called my civil engineering career a joke, had secretly mortgaged his own home to save a criminal. He had risked everything my mother valued most, her social standing, her mansion, her undeniable comfort, without ever telling her. The grand family legacy he always bragged about was a total illusion. They weren't just cash poor, they were drowning in toxic, illegal debt. If the bank discovers the forged signatures, Arthur is looking at significant federal prison time, Ms. Vance added, stepping into the room. And the moment Julian's investors realize their money is gone, he's facing decades behind bars. "Chloe, your family is completely, totally bankrupt. They don't own a single dime that doesn't belong to a creditor." Standing in the center of that war room, staring at the whiteboards that outlined the complete ruin of my family, Harrison's Thanksgiving distribution finally made sense. It wasn't just a character test, it was a precise, calculated calculation. $6 to $8 million was exactly what was needed to clear Julian's debt to Ironclad Data Holdings and pay off the fraudulent mortgages Arthur had secretly taken out on the house. Harrison knew exactly how deep in the mud they were. He had handed them a literal lifeline, and they had burned it. They had looked at the face of their savior, mocked it, and thrown it into the fire because their inflated egos couldn't comprehend that an 85-year-old man held their destiny in his hands. Now there was no lifeline, there was no safety net. The flames they had fueled themselves were about to consume their entire lives. I looked at Marcus, who had been standing quietly by my side, absorbing the massive scale of the destruction. He wrapped his arm around my waist, holding me grounded. "They did this to themselves," he whispered. "You don't owe them guilt, Chloe. You don't owe them sympathy." "I don't feel guilty," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "I feel completely vindicated." Ms. Vance checked her phone, then looked up at me with a sharp expression. "It appears your brother has no intention of going quietly," she said. "Despite the audit, Julian is doubling down on the lie. My contacts in the financial sector just forwarded me an invitation. Julian is hosting a high-profile Series C funding pitch dinner tomorrow night at an exclusive luxury resort in Carmel by the Sea." I frowned, completely baffled. How can he possibly host a pitch dinner if he's entirely insolvent? Where is he getting the money for an event? "He's using the absolute last of the funds from Arthur's fraudulent mortgage," Ms. Vance explained. "He's flown in an incredibly wealthy overseas sovereign fund and a syndicate of Silicon Valley venture capitalists. He plans to stand on that stage and promise them that his business is backed by an imminent, massive family inheritance. He intends to use his lawsuit against you as proof that a massive capital injection is right around the corner. He's going to lie straight to their faces to secure one final multi-million-dollar bridge loan to cover his tracks and flee." The sheer audacity of my brother was breathtaking. Even backed into a corner, with his financials completely exposed to his primary creditor, he was still trying to scam his way out. He planned to stand in a ballroom full of elite investors, using my name and my inheritance to steal more money. I looked back at the whiteboard, then at Ms. Vance. "He wants to talk about the family inheritance?" I said, a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. "I think it's only fair that the sole actual controller of those assets attends the dinner to verify his claims personally." Ms. Vance returned the smile, snapping her briefcase shut with a sharp click. "I'll prepare the legal folders. Vargas, print out the executive summaries of the shell companies and the fraudulent mortgages. We are going to provide his new investors with total financial transparency." The timid girl who used to flinch under her family's cruel stares was gone. In her place stood the majority shareholder of Ironclad Data Holdings. My father and brother wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life. Now it was time to show them exactly how that game ends. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in strategic execution. We weren't just preparing a legal defense against my family's absurd restraining order. We were weaponizing the absolute truth. Vargas and his forensic accounting team worked through the night, compiling a flawless executive summary of Julian's entire fraudulent operation. They printed crisp, high-gloss dossiers detailed with shell companies, defaulted bridge loans, and the illegal second mortgages Arthur had fraudulently secured against the family estate. Ms. Vance drafted a formal demand letter for the immediate dismissal of their lawsuit, outlining the exact federal penalties for submitting a fraudulent medical affidavit and committing perjury in a court of law. I spent the afternoon preparing my own armor. For 34 years, my mother, Eleanor, had dictated what I wore to family events, forcing me into muted colors and conservative cuts to ensure I perfectly blended into the background. She wanted me invisible so her golden boy could shine. That era of submission was permanently over. I walked into a high-end designer boutique in downtown San Francisco, and using the salary I had earned myself as a senior engineer, bought a stunning, structural evening gown made of deep royal blue silk and leather paneling. The dress was sharp, architectural, and completely unapologetic. It demanded attention. When I looked at myself in the dressing room mirror, I didn't see the timid scapegoat my family had spent decades trying to crush. I saw the controller of Ironclad Data Holdings. I saw an independent woman about to dismantle an empire of lies. Marcus stood behind me in the dressing room, his hands resting gently on my bare shoulders. His eyes met mine in the mirror, burning with an intense, fierce pride. "You look absolutely spectacular," he said, his voice steady and grounding. They have absolutely no idea what's about to hit them, Chloe. You're going to walk into that room and take your life back. The luxury resort in Carmel by the Sea was the undisputed crown jewel of the California coastline, and Julian had rented its largest, most extravagant ocean view ballroom to stage his grand deception. As our black SUV pulled up to the valet, the sheer scale of the financial illusion my brother was projecting to the world was staggering. Massive, towering floral arrangements of pure white orchids flanked the entrance. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos carried silver trays laden with premium vintage champagne and imported caviar. A renowned string quartet played softly from a velvet-draped platform. Every single cent paying for this breathless luxury was stolen. It was funded by the final bleeding drops of the mortgage capital Arthur had secured through fraud. They were hosting a multi-$100,000 party while their home was actively hurtling toward foreclosure. We bypassed the main guest check-in list at the front doors. Ms. Vance simply flashed a discreet black card to the resort's general manager, who recognized the powerful attorney instantly. He quietly escorted our group through a side entrance reserved for high dignitaries and VIPs. We slipped into the back of the crowded, brightly lit ballroom, blending seamlessly into the sea of wealthy venture capitalists, Silicon Valley elites, and industry leaders. Scanning the massive room, I spotted my family immediately at the center of the ballroom floor. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Eleanor, dripping in heavy rented diamonds, was laughing brightly with the wives of prominent tech executives, projecting the flawless image of a carefree, wealthy matriarch. She was entirely oblivious to the brutal reality that she was technically living in a home currently owned by the bank. Arthur stood near a massive ice sculpture, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, radiating the aura of a fearless, commanding patriarch. Up close, he looked completely haggard, deep lines of stress permanently etched into his face, but he was playing his part perfectly for the audience. And then there was Julian. My brother was tightly surrounded by the wealthy venture capital consortium he had specifically flown in for this pitch. He was gesturing expansively, pointing toward beautiful high-resolution architectural diagrams of his fictional Web 3.0 exchange displayed on massive easels. His entire body was practically vibrating with a desperate manic energy, but he masterfully disguised it as entrepreneurial passion. I moved silently through the dense crowd, Marcus tight by my side. Ms. Vance and Vargas split off, taking strategic positions near the heavy oak exit doors, ensuring nobody could slip away unnoticed. I drifted close enough to Julian's elite circle to hear his pitch perfectly over the ambient noise of the ballroom. The underlying architecture of Silicon Valley's infrastructure is absolutely ripe for aggressive disruption, Julian boasted, flashing his charismatic, practiced smile to a serious-looking man who appeared to be the lead investor for an overseas sovereign fund. We've secured the core algorithms, and the baseline deployment is underway. We're simply closing out this final bridge round tonight to accelerate the data monopoly phase. The returns on this project will be astronomical. The lead investor frowned slightly, swirling his drink with deep skepticism. Your proposal is remarkably ambitious, Julian, but my financial analysts noticed severe liquidity anomalies in your recent quarterly reporting. You have several projects that have stalled. My consortium requires absolute ironclad guarantees regarding your capital reserves before we commit another $30 million to this venture. I watched Julian's chest tighten beneath his custom suit. He was cornered. The investors weren't fools, and they were asking the exact right questions, but Julian's breathtaking arrogance provided a seamless lie. Those liquidity concerns are completely temporary and wildly exaggerated, Julian lied without a single blink, his voice dripping with false confidence. My grandfather, an incredibly successful, intensely private logistics titan, recently passed away. He left the entirety of his liquid estate directly to me. We are talking about a pure cash trust valued at over $24 million. The investors raised their eyebrows, clearly impressed by the massive figure. Julian smiled, leaning in closer to seal the deal. The capital is currently locked up in a minor probate dispute due to a frivolous, completely absurd objection launched by my estranged sister, Julian continued smoothly, slandering my name to absolute strangers. She has a long history of mental instability and greed, but we've already secured an emergency restraining order against her. A judge will dismiss her baseless claims next week, and those tens of millions will be released directly into my primary holding firm. Your $30 million investment tonight is backed by guaranteed generational wealth. My blood ran cold. The sheer scale of his deception was breathtaking. Julian wasn't just lying about his bankrupt business anymore. He was openly committing textbook federal wire fraud right in front of my eyes. He was deliberately inducing foreign nationals and institutions to hand over $30 million based on a completely fabricated inheritance claim and a fraudulent lawsuit he had maliciously filed against me. He was using my name, my reputation, and the money he had physically burned to ash on Thanksgiving as collateral for a massive financial crime. The target was locked. A wave of cold, crystal-clear focus washed over me. My family had pushed me to the absolute breaking point. They had abused me, isolated me, and tried to starve me out by illegally freezing my bank accounts. They thought they could use my existence as a convenient disposable prop in their criminal theater while they stole tens of millions in my name. They were brutally, fatally wrong. Julian clapped his hands, signaling the string quartet to stop playing. The sudden silence drew the attention of everyone in the room. He walked confidently toward the front of the ballroom, stepping onto the brightly lit stage. He tapped the microphone, testing the audio. The wealthy crowd slowly turned their attention to him, the chatter dying down into a polite, expectant hum. Arthur and Eleanor moved to the front row, looking up at their golden boy with expressions of deep, manufactured pride. They looked like royalty preparing for a coronation. I stepped out from the shadows of the crowded room. I handed my small silk clutch to Marcus and took the heavy, leather-bound dossier from Vargas. The silk of my royal blue gown caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers above, immediately drawing the gaze of the people closest to me. I felt zero fear. I felt zero hesitation. All I felt was the raw, burning power of unyielding truth in my veins. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom, the sound of my heels absorbed by the thick, expensive carpeting. The crowd parted around me, sensing an undeniable shift in the room. I walked straight toward the stage, straight toward the people who had spent 34 years relentlessly trying to minimize my life. The game of lies and shadows was officially over. I didn't rush my steps. I walked with a measured, unbothered pace, letting the tension in the room build naturally. Wealthy venture capitalists turned their heads to watch me, a ripple of collective curiosity moving through their tight circles. Julian, who was gesturing expansively toward his architectural drawings on the easel, froze mid-sentence. His hand remained suspended in the air, his mouth slightly open as his brain struggled to process my presence. Arthur and Eleanor spun around in their seats, the color instantly draining from their faces. My mother's eyes widened in pure, unadulterated panic, her hand flying up to clutch the heavy rented diamond necklace pressed against her throat. My father half stood from his chair, his body tightening aggressively as if bracing for a physical altercation. I ignored them completely, keeping my gaze locked entirely on the man holding the microphone. Julian recovered from his initial shock, quickly masking his panic with a layer of arrogant annoyance. "Chloe," he said directly into the microphone, his voice carrying a patronizing edge that boomed through the speakers. "What an unexpected surprise. We're in the middle of closing a major funding round. I assumed you were currently handling some sensitive legal matters regarding your unfortunate mental health situation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Julian was doubling down in public, weaponizing the lie that I was an unstable family liability to humiliate me into retreating. I didn't stop. I bypassed the front row and stepped directly onto the low stage. I ignored his grandstanding entirely, walking past him to face the lead investor, the very man Julian had been desperately courting just moments before. I handed the man the high-gloss dossier Vargas and his team had painstakingly prepared. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting clearly and confidently through the silent ballroom. "My name is Chloe. I am the sole controlling manager and majority shareholder of Ironclad Data Holdings, the primary holding corporation that officially owns my brother's entire business infrastructure and liabilities." The lead investor frowned, his thick brows knitting together. He looked down at the dossier in his hands, then back up at me. "Ironclad Data Holdings?" he repeated. "Your brother just explicitly stated that his collateral was completely unencumbered and backed by a $24 million family inheritance. He claimed the lawsuit against you was a mere formality to release those funds." Julian lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a violent, crushing grip, his eyes wild with terror. "She's lying!" he hissed into the microphone, his voice cracking violently under the strain. "She's a completely unhinged sociopath. Security! Get security in here right now and remove her!" Marcus stepped onto the stage instantly, his imposing physical presence cutting off Julian's leverage. He placed a heavy hand on Julian's wrist, applying just enough pressure to force him to release his grip on my arm. Julian stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. "Don't touch her," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried perfectly without a microphone. The lead investor opened the dossier, his eyes scanning the first few pages of forensic data. The corporate stamps, the digital ledger signatures, and the certified default notices from Ironclad Data Holdings were undeniable. His face hardened into a mask of pure corporate steel. He turned a freezing gaze toward Julian. "What is the meaning of this, Julian?" the investor demanded, his voice slicing through the tense silence of the ballroom. "These documents show that your entire server network is currently under a seizure directive for non-payment. Your platform doesn't own its own framework. And according to these audited bank ledgers, you are running a massive deficit funded by secondary liabilities." Arthur finally breached the stage, pushing his way past the investors. His face was a dark, furious crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "This is a private family matter," he bellowed at the investors, trying to use his booming corporate lawyer persona to regain control of the room. "My daughter is suffering from a severe psychological episode. She has illegally acquired company files. My firm will handle this internally. Do not review those unauthorized documents." "It's not an episode, Arthur," Ms. Vance's voice rang out from the back of the room. She walked down the center aisle, her sharp heels clicking cleanly against the perimeter of the floor. She held a thick legal folder of her own. "And those documents are fully authorized. I am the executor of Harrison's estate, and I am here to personally serve you and Julian with a formal notice of federal perjury charges and a motion for the immediate dismissal of your fraudulent restraining order." She stepped onto the stage and handed the legal folders directly to my father. "We have submitted irrefutable proof to the Superior Court that the medical affidavit signed by Dr. Aris was backdated and fabricated," Ms. Vance announced to the entire room of elite investors. "The asset freeze on Chloe's accounts has been permanently lifted by judicial order. Furthermore, as the primary shareholder of Ironclad Data Holdings, Chloe has authorized an immediate foreclosure on Julian's technology assets. His platform goes offline at midnight tonight." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The wealthy venture capitalists began to back away from Julian and Arthur, isolating them on the stage as if they carried a plague. The tech executives' wives turned away from Eleanor, leaving her standing entirely alone in the center of the room, her rented diamonds suddenly looking incredibly cheap. Julian looked at the whiteboards of data in the dossier the investor was holding, then looked at me. The arrogant tech visionary was entirely gone. He looked small, broken, and utterly terrified. "You ruined me," Julian whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at the investors who were already pulling out their phones to cancel their wire transfers. "You destroyed everything I built." "You ruined yourself, Julian," I replied, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "You and Dad held $8 million of pure salvation in your hands on Thanksgiving night. You called Grandfather a senile old fool and threw your own survival into the fire because your egos were too massive to accept his gift. You burned your own assets. Now gravity is just taking over." My father looked at the perjury notifications in his hands, his chest heaving as the absolute finality of his ruin settled in. The forged signatures on the Atherton mortgages, the drained retirement accounts, the destroyed career. It was all laid bare in the high-gloss dossiers currently being passed around the room of his peers. He looked at me, his mouth opening to launch another threat, but no sound came out. The powerful patriarch had been completely stripped of his narrative. I turned away from them, walking off the stage with Marcus beside me. We walked down the center aisle of the luxury ballroom, leaving the shattered remnants of their toxic hierarchy behind us. The string quartet remained silent. The white orchids looked like decorations for a funeral. As we reached the heavy oak exit doors, I looked back one final time. Julian was slumped against the presentation easel, his elaborate Web 3.0 diagrams knocked to the floor. Arthur was staring blankly at the legal papers, and Eleanor was silently weeping into her expensive handbag, surrounded by a room full of influential people who would never speak to her again. They had spent 34 years trying to bury me in the shadows of their arrogance. But Harrison had given me the armor to survive the fire, and tonight I walked out of the smoke into a life that was entirely my own. What specific aspect of the story's continuation would you like to explore next? Marcus rushed onto the stage instantly, pinning Julian's wrist with an iron grip. With a sharp, sudden twist, he forced him to break his hold on my arm. "Never touch her again," Marcus stated, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. Ms. Vance marched up the stage steps, standing shoulder to shoulder with me in an unbreakable front of absolute legal authority. The prominent attorney adjusted her glasses, staring directly at the lead investor. "My client is telling you the absolute truth, sir," Ms. Vance announced, amplifying her voice so it carried all the way to the back of the room. "Julian is entirely and completely insolvent. He has zero legal recourse to any alleged family inheritance. On Thanksgiving Day, in front of multiple witnesses including myself, he voluntarily threw his physical inheritance keys into a fireplace and destroyed them." A shockwave of stunned whispers erupted through the ballroom. Arthur violently pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the floor as he stormed toward the stage. "This is absolute madness," Arthur roared, his face turning a furious shade of purple. "Don't listen to a single word she says. We are filing elder abuse and fraud charges against her first thing tomorrow morning. She manipulated my father to steal family property." I turned slowly to face my father, grabbing the microphone from its stand. I ripped it from the clip and brought it close to my mouth, ensuring every single person in this massive room would hear every syllable I was about to speak. "I didn't steal a thing, Dad," I said, my voice completely steady, cutting through the rising chaos like a scalpel. "Grandpa Harrison left the keys to the kingdom to me because I was the only person at that Thanksgiving table who showed him a shred of basic human respect. You and Julian burned your own $8 million access keys because your staggering arrogance wouldn't allow you to accept a gift from an old man you thought was beneath you." I turned back to the investors, addressing them directly. "The narrative my brother sold you tonight is a complete fiction, a multi-million-dollar scam. The Web 3.0 platform he's promising you is a ghost shell. He hasn't written a single line of viable code because he used all his previous investment capital to service the disastrous liabilities of his past, failed ventures. He is running a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme, and you are his final target." Julian lunged for the microphone, his face a mask of desperate panic, but Marcus blocked him physically, pushing him back against the presentation easel. The beautiful architectural drawings crashed to the floor, the heavy foam board splintering apart, shattering the illusion of his tech empire. "The lawsuit my brother filed against me," I continued, raising my voice over the commotion, "is a fraudulent, desperate cover-up. He secured a backdated medical affidavit from a corrupt doctor to temporarily freeze my personal assets, hoping to starve me out before I could expose his financial ruin. But he completely misjudged my strength." I pointed directly at my father, who was now frozen at the edge of the stage, his eyes wide with mounting terror. "And that grand family legacy they keep bragging about? It's the biggest lie of all." To keep Julian's fraudulent shell game afloat, my father secretly drained his entire corporate retirement investment portfolio. Worse, he illegally forged my mother's signature to secure 3 massive fraudulent second mortgages on their primary estate. Their home is currently hurtling toward foreclosure. The great Atherton legacy is completely, totally bankrupt. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and devastatingly permanent. The wealthy socialites, prominent Silicon Valley executives, and foreign venture capitalists stared at my family with expressions of utter shock and horrified disbelief. The flawless veneer had been violently stripped away, exposing the rotting foundation beneath. The lead investor flipped through the dossier I had handed him. He scanned the first page, the executive summary of Julian's debt to Ironclad Data Holdings. He turned to the next page, reviewing the certified proof of Arthur's forged mortgages. He closed the folder with a sharp, definitive snap. He looked at Julian, his expression hardening into pure, icy fury. "You lied straight to my face," he stated, his voice cutting through the silent room. "You attempted to use your sister's inheritance as collateral to defraud my consortium of $30 million. "It's a lie!" Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips. He was hyperventilating, backing away from the investors in a panic. "She's framing me! Those documents are forged! Dad, tell them she's lying!" Arthur didn't say a word. The patriarch, the man who had controlled every narrative and dictated every rule, just stared blankly at the floor. The crushing realization that his entire world was collapsing had completely paralyzed him. He had no defense left. His secrets were out, and his ruin was absolute. Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical wail. She collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The surrounding high society guests physically moved away from her, treating her like a plague. She was watching her country club memberships, her luxury vacations, and her flawless reputation evaporate in real time. The lead investor turned his back on Julian. "We're leaving," he commanded his syndicate. "We will be contacting federal authorities immediately regarding this attempted wire fraud. Never attempt to contact me again." The investors turned in unison, marching toward the exit doors. Their footsteps echoed loudly across the cavernous, silent ballroom. Julian watched them go, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and completely broken. He had lost everything. His investors were gone, his creditors were circling, his father was ruined. He turned that manic, desperate gaze onto me. "Biao Da, you ruined me," he screamed, throwing himself toward the edge of the stage. His face was contorted in absolute agony. "You ruined my life, Chloe. You destroyed everything." I looked down at the brother who had spent a lifetime mocking me, diminishing me, and trying to steal my future. I felt zero pity. I raised the microphone one last time. "I didn't ruin you, Julian," I said, my voice echoing crisply through the empty ballroom. "You threw your own salvation into the fireplace. I just watched it burn." I dropped the microphone, letting it rest on the edge of the stage. The feedback squealed briefly for a fraction of a second before dying out, leaving a heavy, ringing silence over the massive room. Julian fell to his knees on the thick, patterned carpet, gripping his head as the reality of his total destruction squeezed the final bit of air from his lungs. I didn't look back at him. I didn't look at my father, who was staring blankly at the shattered fragments of his fabricated empire. I didn't look at my mother, still sobbing into her hands, realizing her precious social standing had vanished into thin air. I turned my back on all of them. I walked down the stage steps and took Marcus's outstretched hand. His grip was warm and grounding, anchoring me to the reality I had built myself. Ms. Vance and Vargas fell into step with us, forming an impenetrable wall of legal and personal protection on either side. We walked out of the resort through the same side doors we had entered, leaving the toxic wreckage of the Atherton family legacy behind us forever. The cool night air hit my face as we stepped out onto the seaside street, and for the first time in 34 years, I took a breath that felt entirely, completely free. Fast forward one full year. The fallout from that investor pitch dinner was swift and devastating for my family. The absurd restraining order Julian had filed against me was thrown out by a California judge with prejudice. Faced with Ms. Vance's overwhelming evidence of the fabricated medical affidavit, the judge even threatened to have Dr. Aris's medical license revoked. My personal bank accounts were permanently unfrozen, and ironclad data holdings remained firmly under my absolute control. Julian lost far more than his business. He lost his freedom. The moment the foreign investors walked out of that ballroom, they contacted federal authorities. The FBI launched a massive criminal investigation into his startup, uncovering a multi-year system of wire fraud and investor deception. Because I authorized Vargas to hand over our complete forensic audit, Julian had absolutely no defense. His shell companies were dissolved, his assets were seized, and he is currently awaiting trial on multiple counts of federal fraud, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The golden boy who could do no wrong is now relying on a public defender because he can't afford a real lawyer. My parents suffered a fate they considered worse than death itself. They lost their money and their social standing. The moment the bank discovered my father had forged my mother's signature to secure those secret second mortgages, they initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. Arthur and Eleanor were legally evicted from the sprawling, glass-walled mansion where they had spent decades looking down on everyone else. Their luxury cars were repossessed. Their country club memberships were revoked. They were forced to downsize drastically, moving into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a bleak industrial suburb on the outer edges of the Bay Area, worlds away from the elite circles they once ruled. Eleanor no longer hosts lavish dinner parties or complains about the quality of her espresso. She spends her days trapped in a tiny living room, facing the man who secretly gambled away their entire life savings. Arthur is currently under investigation by the SEC for draining corporate retirement accounts to fund a criminal enterprise. They are completely isolated, cut off entirely from the wealthy friends who abandoned them the moment the scandal hit the local news. Of course, they tried to reach out. In the first few months after that dinner, my phone was bombarded with voicemails from my mother, begging for forgiveness and pleading for a small loan just to help them get back on their feet. She claimed that family was supposed to stick together during hard times. My father sent emails demanding that I release funds from the holding firm, insisting that I owed him for raising me. I didn't reply to a single message. I simply forwarded everything to Ms. Vance, who issued a strict cease and desist order, blocking them from contacting me ever again. I changed my phone number. I upgraded our building security and permanently cut off the rotting branches of my family tree. With the toxic weight of my past finally lifted, I turned my attention entirely toward the future. I had $8 million in cleared, verified cash sitting in my private wealth account, and I knew exactly how I wanted to deploy it. I didn't want to hoard it, and I didn't want to blow it on meaningless luxury. I wanted to build something that would outlast me, something that would empower people who had been minimized and underestimated. I used the inheritance to establish a thriving engineering and tech incubator in San Francisco, specifically designed to fund and support women entering the structural engineering and architecture tech sectors. I named it Harrison Labs, honoring the fierce, quiet old man who gave me the keys to my freedom. We provide seed funding, mentorship, and a state-of-the-art workspace for women trying to break into a highly competitive, male-dominated field. We help them build portfolios, launch their physical stress simulation software, and secure patents for their original structural designs. Walking the bright, open-concept floors of Harrison Labs is the most rewarding experience of my career. Every day, I am surrounded by brilliant, driven women who are coding, designing, and creating their own independent success. I watch them pitch to angel investors with absolute, unwavering confidence. I make sure they know their worth. I make sure they never have to shrink themselves to fit into a room full of fragile egos. I gave them the exact same opportunity my grandfather gave me, a chance to build a life on their own terms. My personal life bloomed into something incredibly beautiful as well. Marcus and I were married in a quiet, private ceremony near Harrison's old ranch in Montana. We didn't invite hundreds of wealthy strangers or networkers. We only invited the people who stood by us when the fire was burning the hottest. Ms. Vance was there, raising a glass of vintage champagne to honor my grandfather's memory. Vargas attended too, celebrating the successful dismantling of a fraudulent empire. Marcus and I bought a modern home surrounded by massive redwood trees and peaceful walking trails. The house is filled with light, warmth, and absolute unconditional support. We don't play psychological games. We don't demand sacrifice to prove loyalty. We are simply partners, built on deep mutual respect and shared ambition. Sometimes, as I sit on my back patio drinking my morning coffee, my mind drifts back to that Thanksgiving dinner. I think about the heavy mahogany table, the smell of the roasted turkey, and the suffocating tension that used to rule my entire existence. I remember the exact moment my father and brother held their own salvation in their hands and arrogantly tossed it away. They thought they were destroying some meaningless scrap metal. They had absolutely no idea they were burning their own future. My family once believed that wealth and power gave them the right to treat people like disposable props. They believed they could crush my spirit, steal my joy, and demand my absolute submission. They severely underestimated the quiet girl sitting at the end of the table. They never realized that surviving their abuse didn't make me soft. It forged me into something completely indestructible. I am 35 years old now. I run a major infrastructure tech incubator. I hold the controlling stakes in one of the most significant digital holding firms in the state. I am happily married to a man who respects my strength. I live a rich, beautiful life built entirely on rock-solid boundaries and undeniable self-worth. I don't feel a single ounce of guilt for leaving my parents and brother behind. I don't lose sleep wondering how they are managing in their tiny apartment or what Julian is saying to his public defender. I gave them nothing because they deserved nothing. I let their empire of lies collapse under its own toxic weight. My grandfather Harrison knew exactly what he was doing. He spent his final days on Earth executing a brutal, brilliant character test. He rewarded respect, and he penalized arrogance. He handed me the tools to build a fortress, and I used them to create a kingdom. I am no longer the invisible scapegoat. I am the architect of my own destiny, and my foundation is built on the unyielding truth. Looking back at the ash left inside my parents' expensive fireplace, I learned the most profound lesson of my life. Your worth should never be defined by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. For 34 years, I allowed my family to shrink me. I accepted their narrative, that I was the invisible scapegoat, the disappointing daughter, while they propped up a fragile illusion of superiority. But real power doesn't come from arrogant boasting or maintaining a wealthy facade. It comes from quiet resilience, honest work, and unwavering integrity. My grandfather understood that deeply. He knew that greed would eventually blind people to their own salvation. When my father and brother arrogantly tossed away those vault keys, they burned far more than money. They incinerated their own masks, exposing the rotting core of their entitlement. They taught me that family is not an unconditional free pass for abuse. Sharing DNA doesn't give anyone the right to strip away your peace, your mental health, or your hard-earned success. The greatest inheritance I received wasn't the $8 million or the controlling shares of a massive holding company. It was the absolute realization that I am the sole author of my own life. You don't need to fight a toxic system by its own rules. Sometimes you just have to set an unbreakable boundary, step back, and let their own breathtaking hubris tear down their empire of lies. My beautiful new reality, built entirely on the truth, has left them behind in the very ashes they created.